In nearly all cases with modern health systems, you're waiting months for appointments only to spend a mere 10 minutes with a doctor who quickly hands out a generic diagnosis that is likely rooted in a total misunderstanding of health and causes, and then you're offered a one-size-fits-all medication or invasive treatments with unpleasant side effects. If this sounds all too familiar, consider a different approach with the New Biology Clinic founded by Dr. Tom Cowan, a respected natural health doctor, author, and speaker. Dr. Cowan's holistic perspective on health and wellness and a deep understanding of the true nature of health and disease sets this clinic apart. With the New Biology Clinic, it's not about quick fixes and suppressing symptoms. The practitioners take time to understand your unique story, recognizing that health is unique to the individual and that illnesses have a variety of causes, physically and metaphysically. Members of the New Biology Clinic enjoy a flat monthly fee that includes a range of valuable services like health consults as needed, practitioner-led live streams on diverse health topics, access to a members-only resource library, and multiple live group sessions every month. These sessions cover fitness, breathing integration, biofield tuning, guided meditation, EFT tapping, and much more. Unlike traditional healthcare systems that thrive on frequent visits, prescriptions, treatments, and suppressing symptoms, the New Biology Clinic's motivation is to make you healthy and keep you that way. Visit newbiologyclinic.com to learn more and use code THEWAYFORWARD for $50 off your account activation. If you're a member of The Way Forward, email hello@thewayforward.com to receive $150 off your account activation. Your journey to genuine healing begins here. Dr. Jordan Grant obtained his medical degree from the Texas Tech University School of Medicine with a focus in urology. He and his wife Leah specialize in boutique hormone optimization through Grant Hormone and Wellness. You can find more info about Grant Hormone and Wellness in the show notes. Jordan has a deep understanding of science, the scientific method, philosophy, logic, and epistemology. Since the beginning of 2020 charade, and I will not call it a pandemic, the 2020 charade, Jordan has made a tremendous impact. I say that with emphasis, tremendous impact. I cannot overstate how much of an impact he's made on me and several others in the terrain-based health camp, helping to refine our understanding of the scientific method, what constitutes real science, and how to clearly spot logically fallacious arguments. In this discussion, Jordan and I discuss how we accumulate knowledge, empiricism and rationalism, objective versus subjective truth, cause and effect, science, logical fallacies, and more. For more on Jordan, please head to the link in the show notes. And I want to say one more time, I cannot overstate how much of an impact Jordan has had on refining how I think and really how I view the world and how I consider what I know. Like, do I truly know what I claim to know, and how do we know things? This conversation with Jordan was awesome. And I'm so honored to introduce him to you guys because he's had such a tremendous impact on me, like I said, over the last 4 years. So I think you'll really enjoy this conversation with Jordan. Also, it's not too late to grab your tickets for this year's Music and Sky. Join me, Mike Winter, Eileen McCusick, Melissa Sell, Yerasimos and Joel from Here for the Truth, Amanda Vollmer, and so many more incredible people, June 20th through the 24th in Mendocino, California, for Music and Sky, the great outdoors. There really isn't much better than gathering together with like minds, as I've said. And I've also said events like this and Confluence are kind of like a farmer's market meets a music festival, meets a conference, meets a retreat. Kind of like if all those things had a baby together, that's what you'd get with Music and Sky. So if you're interested in joining us, please head to the link in the show notes for tickets and more info. All right, y'all. Thanks for tuning in and enjoy episode 96 with Dr. Jordan Grant. I am so excited to have this conversation with you because I got to give you credit where credit is due. That if there's one person over the last, well, there's a few people, but if there's one person who has really helped refine the way that I think and think about the things that I know and just thinking in general and distinguishing belief versus knowledge and sort of questioning how we claim to know anything that we claim to know, right? How do we know anything? It's you. It's because of you. And I don't even remember how we were introduced. It was in some chat, I think. It was in one of the chats that Jacob Diaz and I had started, I think the train chat on Telegram. And I just started noticing when we would share some things that we were hearing from virologists, molecular biologists, that at the time I'm like, this seems incorrect what they're claiming as evidence for viruses, but I don't know how to articulate why it's incorrect. And then you would come in and boom, 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 break down the logically fallacious arguments that they're presenting for their claims. And it just blew me away because it was like when you hear something or when you see something articulated for the first time that you've always known inside but never were able to put words to it. It really is incredible, right? But it's different than the classes on philosophy and logic and inductive reasoning versus deductive reasoning, all these things that I did learn at West Point, because not only is that coming from an academic lens, but it's also coming from a very indoctrinating academic lens, right? But yeah, and it's like I kind of threw that aside. I wasn't really interested in philosophy while I was at West Point, but then now I consider myself, I wouldn't say I am a philosopher, but I'm very, very interested in philosophy and just how we know anything at all, right? So thank you for that, and thank you for being here, man.
Man, thanks for having me. Like, this is an honor. You know, I remember seeing your stuff on Twitter, and I wasn't highly active on Twitter.
I'm actually sad you're not highly active on Twitter anymore at
all. I would respond to a few things that you'd say, and I think I would start talking about the scientific method and things like that. And I remember you'd always kind of have positive feedback, and I think you might have joined maybe an infectious myth group on Facebook or something, and we talked a little bit, and then it went to Telegram, I think, after that. Yeah. So there was sort of a process there, but no, man, it's awesome to be here. I never in my life thought I'd be invited to do a video podcast. You know what I mean? Like, I just don't think about that kind of stuff like that. I've done tons of interviews on YouTube stuff for our hormone side of things or religious stuff, whatever. I mean, but doing it this way and I mean, talking to somebody that truly like gets this, that it's passionate about it. It's rare to find your crew, your like-minded crew.
Yeah,
you know?
man.
So I think this is going to be good.
Yeah, it's going to be incredible. I have a lot of stuff for us to get into today. And one of the things I want to start with, because it's relevant as it relates to the last 3.5 years, and really like every claim coming from the scientific community. And this is sort of a big one that I want to distill down into specifics, deductive reasoning, if you will. But the phrase "trust the science," why is that wrong?
Well, we could say it's a reification fallacy, right? We talk about that all the time. It's giving attributes to things that don't have them. So it's science doesn't have a mouth. Science is not an entity that speaks or thinks or acts. It's fine to use phrases like that as long as we're clear with what we mean, right? Just like anything else, we're clear with our definitions. But I think the problem when people say trust the science, so going back to kind of what you and I talk about all the time is you always my go-to thought process is always, what are their base presuppositions in that statement? And if you start thinking like that, you will start kind of breaking it down clearly. Well, they're already presupposing whatever they think science is truth already, because you have to just trust it.
Yeah,
right?
so science is synonymous with truth.
That's what people think.
Right.
And that's been, I think, indoctrinated into us for quite a while, and whether it's in movies or articles or news or whatever. I mean, you see people like Anthony Fauci saying, I am science. And it's insane once you understand what science actually is. But most people don't even know what it is. Yeah. And so when they hear something like trust the science, they just go, yeah, well, I have to trust science because science is truth. Mm-hmm. And the problem is, again, it's sort of an equivocation, I guess, in a way, or a etymological fallacy, because you take the root, the scientia, or the root word, which just means knowledge. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that can't be, if it's just knowledge, well, that can apply to anything. Right. And if it applies to everything, it doesn't mean anything, right? So when people say science, they really deep down think empiricism. They think something that's proven.
Right.
You can get in the weeds with that real quick, and we can talk about that.
That's what I'd like to do, because that is exactly what they think, whether they realize it or not. They're thinking that when they say the phrase "trust the science" and they buy into that phrase, they're already presupposing that this means they're buying into or trusting something that has been shown empirically.
Yep.
And if that is the case, then we can stick it to them and hold their feet to the fire on empiricism. That's right. And that's where the scientific method comes in. And that's what science really is anyway. It's a method.
Yep.
Yeah.
Natural science, at least. What these people are talking about in the context that they use the phrase, they're usually trying to deal with some type of secret of the universe that somebody's figured out, or a natural phenomenon. Like, that's what we're talking about. Right. We're not talking about the science of baking a cake, right? Or the science of sailboating. Like, you could say that, right? That's fine. Right. We know what that means. That has nothing to do with natural science. And this is where a lot of people conflate things. It's interesting, though, because, and we can talk about the scientific method here in a minute, but once you start talking to people in these spaces who say things like, trust the science says, and then you start kind of probing a little deeper about the scientific method and proof, they'll go, whoa, we can't prove anything. Science doesn't prove anything. And you're like, so why are you using it to support your dogmatic claim?
Not only using, why are you weaponizing it amongst the entire world?
Well, I mean, people don't go around wearing T-shirts, because you'll hear this phrase a lot, science can only disprove, it can't prove. Nobody walks around wearing T-shirts saying, the science doesn't say X, Y, Z. They say the science says,
right,
meaning positive claim.
Right.
So it's so funny, because you basically get them backed into a corner, and they realize usually, and instead of just being intellectually honest, they have to twist it around to, well, science doesn't prove anything anyway. And there's a reason they say that, and it's actually deep down maybe true. But the problem is, when it comes to the scientific method, it's very clear cut. It's easy. It's how we think about things, honestly. Yep. It really is. It's not much different than how we deal with man-made issues with technology and tinkering, and when we do trial and error to try to figure out a problem, just like a mechanic would do, and you eliminate one variable or change one thing at a time. It's that kind of logic. And so that's what you're supposed to, quote unquote, do in natural science. And, the first step is obviously you have to have something you're studying, meaning a phenomenon that you want to elucidate the cause of. That's the whole point of the scientific method, is to figure out the cause of something. We're dealing with cause and effect here. And
we're talking specifically about a naturally occurring phenomenon too.
Exactly.
Which means that it is not manipulated or initiated by the investigator.
That's right. But how do you...
Which it gets which gets a little hairy there.
Yeah.
But point being...
Yeah. From a purist perspective.
Yeah, from a purist perspective, it's supposed to be that, again, because if you don't at least try to stick to the purist perspective, then you have what we have, where they're conducting what they call science in a lab, where it's taking a cell and bombarding it with a bunch of stuff and saying, oh, well, this is a naturally observed phenomenon. I'm like, no, it's not.
No.
You completely created that situation artificially in a lab environment outside 100%. Of its natural context. That's not but again, like, if we could dance all day on like, do we have any effect on that thing that we are observing naturally? And it's like, how can we know whether we do or not?
Exactly.
It's like,
exactly. Unless you're omniscient, unless you're God, you don't know. You don't know all the variables at play.
Right.
You just don't.
Right.
But on paper, from a purist perspective, science should deal with trying to determine what causes an observed natural phenomenon. And that's your first step. It's, if some of these things you look up the scientific method on Google, and it'll either say observe a phenomenon or / ask a question. It's like, well, what kind of question? Is my name Jordan Grant? Well, you know what I mean? Like, it's absurd.
I always laugh when I see that. Man. I'm like, ask a question about what?
Yeah, I mean, we could come up with anything. And it's like, how's the scientific method going to help with that? So it really needs to be about natural phenomena.
Right.
And so that's the first step. The second step, now, if that's all you can do, let's just stop there and go, because a lot of people conflate, they commit what's called composition fallacy, where they think that the true, something that's true of the whole or true of the part, that makes it true of the whole. And so they'll say, well, I observed this, therefore I did science. It's like, no. That's just a part of the method.
Right.
If all you can do is observe something, that's all you got.
Yeah.
You got nothing to manipulate. You got no hypothesis to form. Like, you're just done. You're just observing. And that's fine. Now, what the problem is, men start making up stories about what they're observing and the causes of. Yeah. And then we can go into astronomy, astrophysics, all that kind of side. That's none of those areas of study are science.
Right.
And people will probably go, this guy's insane.
Right.
I'm sorry, it's just the truth.
Because we're talking about, with respect to empiricism,
That's right,
and the scientific method, trying to determine the cause of an observed natural phenomenon or the cause of an effect that you're witnessing happen. And when it comes to astronomy, when it comes to really like pretty much all of cosmology and all of the ideas of, stories, and I know you say stories a lot, of any of that stuff, archaeology, you're not able to observe the thing. You're only seeing the effects.
Yep.
Yeah.
Even with history and things like that, you're not even seeing that. You weren't there.
Right.
We don't, I mean, that's a whole nother can of worms, because some people consider history a science. Most people, I think, technically do not.
Yeah.
If you're intellectually honest, you would not consider history natural science.
But people consider mathematics and models a science, though, too.
Yes, and that's I posted a clip of Richard Feynman the other day on my Facebook wall, where he clearly talks about math is not science.
Yep.
It's not. It might be used in science, but math is a language, and we can use language for fiction or nonfiction. It's no different than words, right? And so a lot of the modern day, I call them scientismos, people who say trust the science but don't really know anything about the scientific method. NASA fanboys, all that stuff. I mean, they wear the shirts, or higher level, PhDs and things. Not all of them, but a lot of people. They just don't really know these steps. They don't know these details, and you'll see it to the point where they'll say things like, "There is not just one scientific method."
Yeah, I've seen that.
And again, all you have to do once we talk about the things we're going to talk about is start breaking down their claims and try to figure out how they got from step to step, and you'll quickly see usually there's logical fallacies involved.
Totally.
There's just no getting around it.
Let's use virology as an example here.
Okay.
I've done this before on this podcast, but I think you speak to it so well and so clearly, holding their claims to the fire with respect to the scientific method. So there's a claim that there is a particle floating about causing illness, transmitting between human beings. Let's start there.
Okay. So first step would be, what's your observed phenomenon? Okay. Most people would say symptoms, runny nose. Totally legit.
Yep.
So that's your observed phenomenon. What's your hypothesis? Well, what's a hypothesis? Let's talk about that. It's a prediction, right? A prediction of cause and effect, not a prediction of like an eclipse or something. Like, this is literally a cause and effect prediction. X causes Y. Well, until you can show me where your possible cause has actually been first shown to exist, can't be a part of a hypothesis.
Right.
This is what got me interested in this early on was, I kind of bought into the whole way, it's exosomes, it's this, that, and then I kept going, okay, wait a minute. Scientific method. Like, once I learned scientific method really hard, and I really studied it and just thought about it, it's like, okay, first step, fine, we're there. Hypothesis formation. Where are they getting their independent variable, which is your supposed cause? Where is that in a paper? Show me the foundational studies where these critters, these supposed particles, were identified in reality that could even become your potential cause. And you can't find it. It's just so frustrating. It's like, and nobody, when you really ask people, they'll point to particles on an EM, and it's like, yeah, but we can go into
for those who are listening or watching EM, what he means by that, particles on an electron micrograph image.
Sorry, yes, on electron microscopy.
I'm always thinking in terms of like the viewer. I'm like, I could try to break it down.
We've talked about this so much.
I know,
I forget.
I know.
Because I sound like a broken record all the time.
I know.
But here's the way I sum it up, and you say the same thing I do. It's like, if you claim that X causes Y, X has to first exist in reality and be shown to cause Y. That's it. It's so simple. And most people would go, yeah, that makes sense.
Right.
They would nod their head. And that's why I use the lovely unicorn examples all the time, because people understand none of us have ever seen a unicorn. I mean, I don't know. Maybe one day they did in the past. I don't know. But if I say unicorns are breaking into my yard every night, trampling my grass, and all I show you as proof, quote unquote, is pictures of trampled grass, you would call me an insane person.
Right.
And I'm like,
or horsehair in your yard. Like, we're finding genetic material that we think is from
a chupacabra. You know what I mean? And you're like, well, show me a chupacabra first. And even if they exist, now you got to, can you give me some video? I mean, it's not science.
You got to demonstrate that it actually
show
produces
that they're doing what you
right.
claim. It's just common sense. And I hate that term. I really do. I hate the term common sense, but this is so basic because even little kids understand this. Kids are good at using their imaginations and coming up with stories about, and that's what goes on into adulthood, it seems. But at a basic level, if you claim X causes Y, show me X, and then show it how you know it causes Y. It's just that simple. And that's the scientific method boiled down as base as you can get it.
Yeah, and so with virology, they can't even get off the ground to formulate a hypothesis because you first need to have the thing you think is the cause present and even to begin to even test a hypothesis, and they don't. So let's take it up a step higher. The whole idea that fluids from a sick person cause disease in a healthy person. Let's use that as an example.
So that could be an easy thing to test, and they have. I mean, Daniel Roydus just wrote a book about it. I mean, he gave example after example after example of failed quote unquote experiments. Could not prove contagion. I mean, we always reference the Rosenau study with the Spanish flu because it was so powerful because, we're told it was just the most deadly, contagious thing in history, whatever. And yet they expose people to each other with pretty impressive means of doing it.
Right.
Nobody gets sick. And then, of course, they have to build rescue devices for why didn't they get sick? Because they need contagion.
Yeah.
So that they have to form these ad hoc rescue devices to explain, well, they were just already all immune. It's like, what is immune?
Yeah.
But yeah, no, you're right. In virology, let's forget the virus part and just talk about contagion because those are actually two separate topics.
They are two separate topics.
And this is, again, part of thinking clearly. It's everything has to be taken on its own terms. Just because quote unquote viruses have never been proven to exist and cause disease, does that mean contagion might not be real? No, it might be.
And vice versa too.
And vice versa. You would think though with the virus claims that would lead to contagion, you would think, you know what I mean? At least according to the story. But you got to separate these things out. And I mean, we could do this with so many different topics because people like to lump things together to make it easier, to make a system.
Yeah.
But every claim has to be taken on its own. Every cause and effect claim should be taken on its own.
Yeah.
And so the question always comes to is how was it proven? And you'll come across a lot of people, especially more the higher level, like PhDs, and they'll go into you can't prove anything at all. But what they then try to push is that their story that they've come up with is the quote unquote best explanation for the effect. And it's like best. Okay, you just used a ethical term. But you when anybody says the word best or close to the truth or any of those things, you go, what's your standard? What do you mean best? Best according to what?
Right.
It's like the people that try to push the whole Occam's razor thing as some kind of good way to think. It's like that has nothing to do with reality at all. Just because it might be in your head the best explanation for something, so what?
Right.
I can come up with 1,000 different stories that are coherent, logically consistent to explain something, and they may all be false. Mm-hmm. We do this every day. I talk about this with Leah, my wife, all the time because we do it on a personal level. Let's say you hear a story on Facebook or somebody that you know and grew up with got arrested or they did something, and immediately your mind starts filling the gaps in to try to figure out why did they do that. And it becomes gossip. I mean, that's what we all do it, right? Mm-hmm. But you have to catch yourself and go, whoa. I just made up a story in my head about why I think that person did that when first of all, I don't even know if they did it. Second of all, just because my story makes sense in my head doesn't mean it's true. Now you take that and extrapolate that out to all this other stuff, and that's what's going on 99.9% of the time, maybe more.
Yeah. I think that you've used another example too when 100 people are looking at a painting and trying to figure out what the painting means.
Yeah.
And the reality is the only one who can ever know what the painting actually means is the individual who painted it. Yeah. And by revealing it himself or the story that for why he created the painting and what it means to other people. That's the only way.
Exactly.
I think we talked about this at dinner last night. Walter Russell, who has some things that I don't agree with, but he says a lot of great stuff. And he says that if you're trying to figure out things by just observing cause and effect, you will never be able to actually figure them out. And that's where I think that it's funny that scientists will say, well, we can't prove anything. I'm like, yeah, I actually agree with that. But you're really trying to make it seem like you've proven something. And then again, you're weaponizing it against the entire world and structuring society around the thing that you even agree you can't even prove is true.
That's right.
Yeah.
So that's my rub, right? That's my dividing line. if you want to make up concepts in your head or stories to quote unquote explain something going on, usually it's not even natural phenomena it's technology. It's tinkering and coming up with things, and then they build a story about why that works that way. Whatever, that's fine. When it's not okay, and this can dive into more of the morality voluntarist principles, it's when you then have tyranny from it. When you're locking down the world, when you're demanding masking and jabbing, or let's say with genetics, let's say genomics. Nobody can show you a gene, nobody. But yet you're going to...
Can you emphasize that real quick? I know you're making a point
the reason
here.
I say that is because, again, when you go down to the foundational level, you go, okay, what's a gene? Well, supposedly it's a string of nucleotides together that make up a word, quote unquote, right? That's how they at least push it.
Right.
Well, in order to have a word, you have to have letters. That would be the single nucleotide.
Right.
Show me a single nucleotide and how it was ever validated to be that. Right. Nobody can.
No.
And a lot of them will admit that it's like a model that they've made up. And it's like, well, that's fine. It's a model, but you're turning it into reality to the point where somebody tests positive for BRCA2 gene, quote unquote, and women are chopping their breasts off prophylactically. That's not okay.
Yep.
So that's my personal, and we all have our own dividing lines, but that's for me when it becomes, when you take reification and concepts to, no, it's dogma now, it's reality, and we're going to put our boot on your neck because of our beliefs about this, then it's not okay anymore. Mm-hmm. That's my, I think we'd agree with that. And totally. I think a lot of people would agree with that concept at least. I think they just disagree on what's truly been shown to be true or not. So
yeah, and I think that's what at the least differentiates most of us who are genuine free thinkers in the health freedom or freedom movement, whatever. I don't even like calling it a movement, but are interested in these things is that right there. It's that if this is leading to you saying I must do X, Y, and Z, then you better be able to show me how you determined that thing that you're telling me to do.
That's right.
And they can't when you hold their feet to it. And this is, I think I want to get into this topic a little bit later because I want to play with logical fallacies and things like this, because this really ends up at, well, how can we know anything like I just talked about? And that can lead into nihilism. But let's set that aside for a second, because I want to talk about empiricism versus rationalism a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah. So empiricism is what we were just touching on with the scientific method, but that's one aspect, that's one subset of empiricism, you could say.
Right.
And empiricism really deals with accumulating knowledge using senses alone.
So
right?
From a foundationalist standpoint, and in philosophy, foundationalism is more like your starting points, right? Where are we starting from to get off the ground? Because everybody chooses without even knowing it. And we can get into that later. Empiricism is a little different from evidentialism. We all kind of try to use evidences, usually fallaciously. Empiricism takes it back to a base level of how, because in philosophy, epistemology is the mother of philosophy. How can I know anything? Yeah. How do I justify knowledge? Mm-hmm. Knowledge is tricky to define. Different people have different opinions in what knowledge is. In my mind, true knowledge is truth. It means I cannot be wrong. Yeah. Infallible. Mm-hmm. That's tricky. But if we're going to have to stick with how can I know, because that's basically how we think. When we think of knowing something, we feel like we know it. Mm-hmm. So on empiricism level, it's everything, all knowledge comes by way of sensation alone. Now, it may not be that hardcore anymore. There used to be a group of empiricist philosophers that were called logical positivists, where they rejected the metaphysical just from the start. Without any real reason, they just rejected it. So the only thing you could know would be anything physical, right? Yeah. That's not
strict materialist.
That was pretty much done away with by some other empiricist philosophers, actually, who kind of called them to the table like, this doesn't really work. Yeah. So a lot of the arguments I use are really more against that strict, pure materialist empiricist philosophy. The problem with, you could say this because I call empiricism the common sense philosophy that we all think on the surface it makes sense until you dive a little deeper, because sensations alone don't give any information. I have to have a mind in order to interpret it. Just like if I didn't know anything at all, I was a quote unquote blank slate and somebody held a painting in front of me, I wouldn't even know what was going on. Yeah. I have no knowledge at all in my head, right? So you have to already have, and I believe, personally, this is a belief, more in the Platonic idea ideas, this realm of ideas that we already are all born with these categories of knowledge in our minds so that we can then interact with this external world and interpret the world.
Sure seems like that too.
Yeah. But the problem with interpreting the world is interpretation depends on your presuppositions.
Right.
And we all have different ones. Like, how do you get those presuppositions?
Like, how do you really, truly form an unbiased, like a totally objective?
Exactly.
Can you?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that you get into the weeds with this stuff because you can think yourself in circles going, is there an objective reality at all? Is everything subjective? We talked about this last night at dinner that, David Hume, who was a Scottish philosopher, empiricist, he argued for empiricism, by the end is basically saying he's just a skeptic. He can't know there's any external world at all. You end up in solipsism because the issue is if everything is merely perception, you can't check your perceptions against the supposed real world. How do you check that? It gets you into the weeds. And so, and I can't remember the quote, a hero of mine, John Robbins, he was a Christian philosopher. He said, empiricism starts by promising you the world and ends up locking you in a prison of your own mind.
Yeah.
And it does. It really does. But I would say a lot of philosophies end up doing that. And we could end up there no matter what if you think hard enough on the how do you know question, because I did it as a kid. We all do. We go, but why? But why? And you end up in an infinite regress until you get to a starting point.
Yeah.
But empiricism as a philosophy is more the just sensation alone. And there's so many issues with that. Like last night we talked about memory, because empiricism relies on, you'd have to have some kind of theory of memory, because once the moment has passed, you're supposed to remember what you actually saw, but from an empirical standpoint, it's only supposed to be what you're experiencing at any moment. But it's already gone.
Any present moment.
Every moment's gone. It's the same thing with history. It's no different. When you appeal to history, it's like, were you there? And even if you were there, if you see something happening, do you know all the details of why that's happening? Or are you going to make up a story about what you think just happened? This is why you get different witnesses in courtrooms and they have different stories. Well, they're seeing things from their perspective.
Well, I mean, think of it like this too, for those who are listening and think that sounds a little bit crazy. Look at what's happened over the last three and a half years. How many different perspectives are there of that, even amongst the so-called experts or those who would write the history books?
Yep.
Like, there are so many different ways you could frame what happened over the last 3.5 years. And even if you took 1,000 people and had them write their own testimony of what happened over the last 3.5 years, it's not going to represent the total spectrum of what actually happened according to each individual.
That's right. Exactly. And that's the issue with history, historiography, the study of more like a philosophy of history. Mm-hmm. If you really start diving into that topic, it'll blow your mind. Because you realize most historical claims, a lot of them are built on affirming the consequent logical fallacies. If this is true, then we'll expect to find these artifacts. We did find these artifacts, therefore this is true. That's not how it works.
Yeah, can you explain as best as you can, in very detailed in layman's terms, affirming the consequent?
It is my favorite logical fallacy because it's probably the one that once you recognize it, you will see it everywhere. Mm-hmm. And I will never forget when I had that aha moment. It was probably 2005. I was reading a book called Philosophy of Science and Belief in God by Gordon Clark. And even though Clark didn't get the science definition right, he kind of equated technology. He was using the what people would use now as the definition of science, mm-hmm. which I think was inaccurate, but he wasn't being dishonest. He just was using that definition. Anyway, he went into affirming the consequent in there and about how pretty much all quote unquote scientific laws use affirming the consequent logical fallacy. And Bertrand Russell, who was an atheist philosopher, admitted to this. So what affirming the consequent is, it's a formal logical fallacy, formal meaning the form of the sentence, the form of the syllogism. Basically, it is if P, then Q, Q, therefore P. If this is true, then that is true, therefore this is true. And
the rain example is a good one.
The rain is a good, so the easy examples help you solidify it in your head. Because I could make anything up. I'll first give the one that Bertrand Russell used, just so people know that I'm not just making this stuff up. And I can't remember word for word, but I think the example he used was if bread is a stone and is nourishing, then when I eat this bread, it will nourish me. Or I'll be whatever. I did eat the bread and it nourished me. Therefore, bread is a stone and stones are nourishing. And it's like, and he said people would think me crazy, but this is not different from all scientific laws, is what he said. Now, we get in the weeds with what a scientific law is versus a scientific theory, because those guys don't even actually use the lingo correctly. But the point is still the same, is that using that type of reasoning to make a cause claim, to make a claim is fallacious. Doesn't mean that your conclusion is false necessarily, because you could get there by accident. You could be right by accident, but using that logic. So if I said, if unicorns urinate in the sky, it will rain. That's what causes rain. And I look outside, well, it's raining. So see, that proves that unicorns are up there. And you're like, dude, that's insane.
Yeah. Or even the other one that's even easier than that. If my car is wet, or if it rains, my car will be wet.
Yep.
My car is wet, therefore it must have rained.
I love it.
And it's like what you've pointed out really well is, unless the only possible way your car could ever be wet in any instance is because of rain, then you cannot say that it is logically fallacious.
Correct. Yeah. Correct. That's 100% right. And because a fire truck could have driven by and sprayed your truck.
Right. Or some kids coming by.
Kids come by, or the sprinklers went off. Now, if you look around the neighborhood and everything's wet and you saw it raining, okay, fine.
Yeah.
The problem is a lot of people will still, they're okay with affirming the consequent because they're like, well, what's the most likely? Well, how do you know what's most? Statistics doesn't tell you what's going to happen at any one moment. It's looking backwards. Right. Okay, it's the same thing that we say with stock market. Past results aren't guarantee a future. Same thing.
Right.
But here's the ironic part. I can still use an affirming the consequent logical fallacy to use it in a statistical way about what might be most probable. If your claimed cause has never been shown to exist, you're in a whole different category.
I called you about that like a month ago. I was like, wait, isn't this both circular reasoning, begging the question, and affirming the consequent at the same time? It's two baked into one when it comes to virology.
Right. And that's what you'll see.
Yeah.
Yep. Virology, a lot of cosmology, a lot of things regarding the nature of the earth. All of these arguments usually rely on both question begging and then affirming the consequent to quote unquote prove your question beg it's insane.
Yeah.
I found a quote when I was preparing for my presentation that I did last week on this topic. And I didn't put it in my presentation because it got too wordy, but it was somebody basically it was like a Quora forum thing. And the guy, he got it. He was like a kind of a scientismo, but he's like, wait a minute, guys. He was talking about affirming the consequent. He's like, I think everything we're talking about is affirming the consequent. He's like, essentially though, but if we don't get to affirm the consequent, we can't come up with all our theories. And he didn't like that.
Yeah.
So he's like, we're just going to have to do it anyway. And it was like, he understood, but then they're like, I need to be able to beg the question and affirm the consequent. Otherwise, I can't spin my story. And it's like, why don't you just say you don't know? Yeah. Why is that so hard?
Right.
But it's something about human nature that we need a story to make sense of something.
Yeah.
And I'll give you another example, sort of in a reverse way. And this may be an example. It's called denying the antecedent. I don't know for sure, but I'll give you the example. I saw it on Instagram the other day, and it was a girl who was talking about she was been diagnosed with some skin cancer, and she said she got it from the sun. So a lot of people, I think it was kind of somebody in our community, in the health freedom community. And so people in the comments were kind of asking her, like, how do you know that it was the sun? And people started railing against these people for asking, saying, you're invalidating her experience. So I, of course, had to jump in and tell them that they were insane for saying this, because denying or asking about the claimed cause in no way invalidates the effect.
Right.
Those are two separate things.
Like, you clearly have skin cancer.
Yes.
I'm not saying you don't have skin cancer.
Exactly.
I'm not saying that's a tough thing to deal with. We are questioning what the cause is of skin cancer.
Is the sun the only possible way you could have gotten skin cancer? If so, how do you know that?
Right. Where is that ever established that the sun is the cause?
Exactly. Right. So that's the point. And a lot of people don't they get very, the other example I use is 9/11, right? And whether you believe people died or not, whatever.
Right.
Let's say people died. Questioning the narrative, you'll see people get really angry and go, you're disrespecting the dead. It's like, no, I'm not. It's actually respecting them to try to figure out the truth, but doesn't negate the effect. Right. The effect is real. And people they need to, but they seem to have a trouble separating claimed cause from real effect. Right. And this happened during COVID because it's already built into our minds that it's a virus that causes these symptoms. I had it to the point where when we were questioning the virus part, people would go, so you don't think people get sick? I'm like, I'm a physician. Of course people get sick. You know what I'm saying? It's silly, isn't it? But they literally in a guttural way, they just go there. It's this gut reaction that people have, and it's fascinating to me. And you see it in comments on Facebook all the time. And it's this kind of, it's a kind of hasty generalization, really just a non sequitur, meaning that doesn't logically follow from the premise. Like, how did you get there? Right. I didn't say that symptoms don't exist. We were talking about, and this is why it's so important to be clear about what you're talking about, define your terms, be hyper specific, probably to the point of being pedantic. People don't like that. I just think if we're really going to try and talk about these kind of important topics, you have to be that specific.
Especially when we're considered fringe, right? Then it's on us to really, really be diligent about how we're communicating.
I totally agree. Yeah. I agree.
And the other one, and I know you acknowledged it a little bit, but even those in the health freedom space, when they say, I got COVID and this, I'm like, you didn't get COVID. And you're like, what? You're denying my experience? I'm like, no. I'm not denying your experience. Exactly. I'm not even denying that you're saying I was sicker than I've ever been, or I had symptoms that I've never experienced before. No one is denying that phenomenon. Right. We are simply trying to determine what the cause was of that phenomenon. And those that are claiming they have evidence of the cause, their evidence doesn't hold water.
That's right. But they won't believe it because they want to, quote unquote, trust the experts, the consensus, or just what everybody knows, quote unquote. Right. And it's like, do you know it?
Right.
But that is it's so important. Because we're not trying to be jerks when we question these things at all. It's about truth. And I saw this in medicine when I was a urologist, and nothing to do with virology. People would come in and already have a story in their head, or a friend told them, or another doctor told them about why they were having X symptom, why their back was hurting. They come to us because they go, oh, I know I have a kidney stone. Well, how do you know? Well, my friend said it. That's what you got based on the symptoms. And I'm like, well, let's get a CAT scan real quick. No stone. And they get mad. They literally get mad at me for telling them, hey, good news, you don't have a stone. Why does my back hurt? Because they'd already accepted the story. They were ready. So they built it up in their head, and then all of a sudden you give them anxiety because you're telling them that what they had in their head was wrong about their real symptom.
And this leads into identity, informing an identity around a story, because that's what just happened there. And that's why these paradigms that are demonstrably false are so hard to challenge. Obviously, there's a lot of money and possible nefarious activity involved in them, right? But like, more important than that, I think, when it comes to virologists, as an example, people will say, oh, you think that all virologists are in on this grand scheme? No, I do not. Nope. They've formed an identity around this, and it is hard for them to question the entire identity that they formed, because they conflate who they are as a man or as a woman with this identity of virologist and all of the schooling that they've had over the last however many years.
It is, it's hard to break out of things that especially when you're working for a living, making money in a field, and somebody tells you like, hey, what you're doing is not really based on what you think it is. I get it. I mean, that can be shocking.
Dude, you're freaking MD.
I get it, but I'm one of those people that I'm like, if I'm thinking incorrectly, I want to know and I will change it. But that's not, and I'm not saying I'm a better person, because I'm just built that way. I always have been. It's as much of a curse as a blessing. I'll just be honest with you, because you end up questioning everything, and you piss a lot of people off. Like a lot
of people wear question everything t-shirts, but how many of them
they don't? And I tell people this all the time. If you want to piss somebody off really quick, you ask them, how do you know that?
Right.
You just ask them.
Right.
You will quickly understand if they know it, if they believe it, or if they're filling your head with a story and they're going to start, using fallacies against you real quick. But what you said just then about, and I'm not a psychologist, like I love that stuff, but I'm not good on it, because all this blends together. Like, there's the sciencey part, and then there's the psychology, the whole mass formation, whatever you want to call it, that people have already done a good job talking about. But that whole thing about forming an identity, it's fascinating to me, because I've seen it so many times in my practice, thousands and thousands of patients. There's something to it. And it's the same thing with sort of forming an identity with collectivism, forming an identity around the flag that rules over you, to the point where you will kill other people because your identity is so tied up with that flag or what you think it means. And again, we are the crazy ones apparently for just saying like, that's insane. Like, we are all individuals. We're all responsible for our own actions. You can't appeal to a collective. Like, and I know this is a separate topic, but I brought that up at the conference this last week as an aside when we were talking about logic and everything, because we were talking about thinking, and I was talking about who thinks. People think. Humans think, right? That's who uses logic. Groups cannot think. There is no such thing as groupthink. We use that term because we know what it means. It means follow in the crowd. but the collective is not an organism that thinks. It's kind of a reification fallacy.
Right.
The government doesn't think. People do. People make policies. People start wars. Like, you have to understand that the science doesn't think. And I just think it's important for people to understand those kind of things, even though deep down we know it. But it's important to be precise.
It's interesting too, because when you start buying into the idea that an entity can think and an entity can do, it then creates a situation where you're willing to defer responsibility to a group rather than take responsibility as an individual.
Just following orders, man.
Yeah.
That was my example. Is like
you personify an entity like that then like allows you to shift responsibility to the whole entity rather than you as an individual making decisions within that group. And
it's just the same with, in a way, maybe a little different, where people say, well, just trust the experts. I just trust them. It's like, they're individuals who a lot of them disagree with each other. And then I go back to my whole, okay, what standard are you using to judge the experts? Because if they don't agree, they can't both be right or all be right. So how are you going to judge who's right? And they don't have an answer for that. And usually they go with consensus, gut feeling.
Mainstream. It's literally just mainstream.
It's mainstream.
Yeah.
It's whatever the mainstream says. And even if they change their mind on something 2 years ago, you're like, but 2 years ago they said the opposite. You're like, nope, they were right. See, they got more information. That's what they'll say. Right. They learned more. And it's like, that's not how it works. Right. Not with real science, not with cause and effect and all this. If you're talking about observational studies and statistics, man, just whatever. You can go off the rails with that, but that doesn't give you any cause and effect. And people know that. When you go through med school, and you go through all the different stuff regarding the studies we do I say we as a collective, MDs and people in that field do, because people think that's science. It's not. It's all observational studies, correlation studies. We're taught right away, correlation is not causation. We all hear that. But do you know what these papers are still pushing out? They're pushing out essentially causes. They won't quite say it, but it's formulated that way. And if you just go break down the papers, you realize nothing in any of these papers has to do with actual cause and effect. Epidemiology is not natural science. And you can find plenty of papers talking about that, admitting it. But if you talk to a run-of-the-mill scientismo about it, they're going to call you names for saying that epidemiology is not science. Right. So that's where, and you pick your battles, but this is where definitions matter. And if you find people that, if you don't agree on definitions, you may as well not really talk, because you're speaking a different language.
And I want to tie up the scientific method, because we never finished that actually. Dude, there's so many things to cover, and it's like, dang, I want to pull on that thread, but I want to come back there first. So with respect to the scientific method, you have to have the presumed cause by itself to vary and manipulate to see if it produces the effect. And this is where it gets a little sticky. And we kind of hinted at it even as we were talking about like us observing it. The same thing applies to variables, right? You can try to eliminate confounding variables as best you can, but because we are having to rely on our senses and our own judgment based on those senses, how do we know if we're actually eliminating all the variables to say we truly have the thing by itself to vary and manipulate? Because when it comes to virology, that one is crystal clear. They're getting a muck of fluid from a sick person. Like, very clearly there's a lot of things in there. But even if I have you by yourself, the individual, and you are the presumed cause for an effect, like you, Jordan Grant, there's so much more to you possibly. There's so much more to what's going on in the situation between you and the thing that you are allegedly having an effect on than I can even know with my own senses. And that's the whole point. And that's where it's like, can we really even know anything or establish any actual causal relationship with the scientific method at all?
I don't know anymore, honestly. I don't think so. And it doesn't.
I love that refreshing answer.
Yeah. I think about this stuff. Like, this is literally what I lay in bed at night and think about is, can we actually prove? Because then you start asking more questions. You go, okay, to the control variables. Well, technically I'm supposed to control everything but the one. Is that how it works in reality?
No.
The way, I'll say, God designed the true natural phenomena we see, how the heck do I know what all is interplaying at that? Right. You don't have a clue. So you end up basically doing what humans do with everything else, is creating technology in a lab and making up a story about what's going on under the surface at an unseen level. In the end, it's men manipulating the world around them to get a desired effect.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with that when it comes to technology. And that's how all this stuff has come about. It's not because anybody's seen a photon or an electron or any of the quantums. It's mainly trial and error and people over time tinkering and modifying and taking ideas, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that's what you really get. And I mean, I'm to the point where I really think almost everything is man-made. These things that like a lot of diseases and illnesses is that we have brought these upon ourselves with the technology that we've created. But back to the scientific method, I use it more as a hostile witness against those claiming science, because if you're not even attempting to follow those steps, we're going to have a problem real quick, because the minute we start talking about what your claims are, we're going to find quite a few logical fallacies. Right. And you either admit that or you don't. You know what I mean? Like, right. and it is what it is, but I think it's important for the world or people to understand these things so that they can then see the reasoning behind how did you get from A to B to C to D. You know, if it wasn't by following the scientific method, well, what were you doing? Right. And that's where you get a lot of these rescue device stories that's like, you know, the modern philosophy of science, if you read like Thomas Kuhn or Lakatos or some of these guys, things changed somehow in, I don't know, the 19th and 20th century to where it wasn't about scientific method anymore. It was about who can come up with the story, I'm going to keep saying that because that's what it is, to best explain something. And that story stands until somebody can come and falsify that story and give a better one. And it's like, that's absurd. Absurd. But that's philosophy. That's not science. That is the story of philosophy. Men sitting around making up stories about the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. Right. You know? Right. And so it's just interesting when you do a deep dive on that stuff, especially once you understand the scientific method. That way you have a standard to judge these other claims against. And you quickly realize that nobody's following the scientific method anymore. I don't know if they ever have. Or if you can.
At the least, though, we could kind of say that the scientific method is useful in order to falsify things, to show what clearly has not been demonstrated to be the cause of an effect.
I will also say that that is a benefit of observational studies, because you would think if something is causing something, it should correlate. Right. If you have no correlation at all, you probably can mark that off the list. I talked to Andy Kaufman about that a few years ago. We were talking about the scientific method. I think get a little presentation or something, and you know, he made the claim that, you know, observational studies could be used to generate hypotheses. Absolutely, 100%, and it can also be used to falsify. And the way I think about falsification, we're going to go back to logic real quick. We already talked about affirming the consequent, right? There's another syllogism called modus tollens. And I want to hit on this, and you don't have to know the word. It is what it is. Right. But modus tollens is beautiful in falsifying. Right. It's if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P.
Because it's similar to affirming the consequent, but not the same thing. This is an actual logical...
Yeah, it's legitimate because instead of affirming the consequent, you're denying the consequent. And the consequent has to be there if the antecedent is there. Has to be. Yeah. If no consequent, then the antecedent is also not true.
Can you give a good modus tollens example?
Oh man, I could give you a there's different ways to do it. I mean, I could give you one from, let's say from my perspective, like I'm a Christian, right? I'll give you a biblical one. Paul uses this in 1 Corinthians 15 regarding some people in Corinth were denying that the general resurrection of the dead, not Christ's resurrection. Paul goes on to say, if the dead are not raised, then Christ also is not raised. Why? Because if Christ is raised, then the dead are also raised. If you deny that the dead rise, you also need to go back and deny it because they're linked. Right. That's the point. Right. It's a one-to-one linkage. If you deny the latter, you have to deny the former. Right. I could do it with certain claims about the curvature of the earth, right? You could do that. You could do it with Coriolis effect because the antecedents we should see happen if we truly have an inertial and a non-inertial reference frame don't exist. Therefore, your claims regarding those are wrong. There's no way around it. It is rock solid. You know,
can you expand upon that one real quick, because that's well, a tough one.
This is where people change the definition of the Coriolis effect because they understand that you actually don't have Earth-based Coriolis. The Coriolis effect is two separate reference frames. The easiest way to think about it is like a merry-go-round, right? If somebody's spinning on a merry-go-round and there's two people standing outside of it throwing a ball overhead. When you're on the merry-go-round spinning around, it looks like that ball is curving. When in reality, if you're standing as an outside observer, that ball's going straight over the merry-go-round. Mm-hmm. It's you that's turning. Well, that's supposed to be what happens to create this Coriolis effect, because that is the Coriolis effect. It's a not actual effect. It's a perceived effect from the observer on the turning reference frame. Right. So the claim, or it used to be the claim, you can still find it in old like textbooks and stuff, is that on the Earth is spinning, right, on an axis, but things unattached are not. That's where you get the whole nonsense about snipers having to account for the rotation of the Earth. Well, if the Earth is turning under bullets, it turns under anything not attached, including hot air balloons, airplanes, helicopters, drones. Well, guess what? That doesn't happen.
Right.
I don't launch a drone and see it whiz away from me at whatever the tangential velocity is supposed to be. That's what would happen.
Right.
So that's modus tollens. If X, then Y, not Y, therefore not X. It ain't turning, at least not in the way you're saying.
Right.
And it's the same thing with like the Earth curve calculator and all this stuff. And I'm not making claims about
and this is the important point too.
Yeah.
When it comes to any of this stuff, when it comes to virology, what we're talking about right now is we're not making positive claims. And if we are, at the least, Jordan, you do it so well. And I admit that I sometimes will make a claim and not distinguish, hey, this is my opinion on something. This is what I think based on what I've come to understand and perceive and read, blah, 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 blah. But the issue is when it comes to the globe, when it comes to virology, when it comes to any of these so-called, quote, scientific claims, is they're the ones making the positive claim. And when you analyze their positive claims and hold their feet to the fire, it turns out that it's nonsense.
And that's the important part, because anybody that's interested in truth, I would think they'd want to mark things off the list that aren't true, right? And so that's what I'm more concerned with cosmology and the shape of the Earth, all these things that people get bogged down in, because I see flat earthers making all kinds of positive claims that they can't back up.
Like
and
the ice wall.
Yeah, ice walls and all. It's like, you don't know that. You know what I mean? Like, have you seen the entire layout of the Earth? How do you know it's not never ending? I mean, you don't know.
Right.
We can make up any story we want, right? I mean, we know, quote unquote, we seem to know how water behaves. We seem to know about water levels, right? We know that. We seem to understand these claims made, that if you want to get into Earth curve calculators, well, you can prove or show that they're not accurate.
Entropy.
Well, yeah, I mean, all these things. Right. But going back real quick to affirming the consequent, because I want to get this in before we even shift gears. With virology, that's another one where it hit me right away, seeing what the minute I ever first read a paper, when Andy Kaufman said, go read the SARS-CoV-1 paper and tell me what you think. Because I'd asked him about SARS. I wasn't even thinking about this stuff at the time. I'd kind of just forgotten a lot of this that I learned when I read Gordon Clark's book in 2005. Because when I went into med school, I saw this fallacy in everything. Books we're reading, the claims being made about in histology classes where they show you electron micrograph images and they put an arrow somewhere and say, this causes this. And I'm going, you don't have a clue. It's insane. Right. I mean, as an aside, I remember on Twitter, these virology guys being like, they just post an electron micrograph image and go, interpret this.
Right.
It's like, you must not have ever really taken any like philosophy courses, because that's absurd. Interpret based on what? Pick a picture is just an image. How do I know what that even is? Right. And then if you're going to tell me what it is, well, how do you know that? Anyway, but a great example of affirming the consequent is what is done literally in the lab to quote unquote prove viruses. They'll say, if a virus is present in these fluids, that's your if P, then we will see cytopathic effect in the cell line Q. We do see cytopathic effect. That's their test. Therefore, this is a proof of a virus. It is a fallacy.
Right.
Okay, first of all, cytopathic effect in a cell culture is not a valid observed natural phenomenon. That is not a valid dependent variable. Your dependent variable is the thing you're studying, right? It's the effect.
Symptoms.
The effect, symptoms, whatever you want to call it. Well, cell cultures, we're not tripping over cell cultures out in nature. You know what I mean? Like the fact that you've already taken cells and taken them out of a body and put them in a petri dish alone invalidates any claims you're going to make about it. But then that's bad enough, but then they don't actually use an independent variable other than some snot or some kind of fluid that's never pure. But even if it was...
But then they add that to viral transport medium, which contains amphotericin B, gentamicin, and they add a bunch of other substances.
And they have reasons. I get it. I know what those reasons are. It doesn't matter.
No.
You can come up with all reasons. It's still going to cloud the picture. And anybody who is a purist at science would call that out. That's the problem, I think, is that over the years and over time, precision and honesty has been lost. And I'm not saying these people are dishonest. It's more the training and the education that true science and being specific and caring about logic, it's just not taught that much. Mm-hmm. And that's what bothers me, because a lot of these guys are PhDs. I mean, literally doctorates in philosophy. But yet you're employing an affirming the consequent fallacy in your lab every day without thinking about it. And, we've talked to, Mike Donio about this stuff. I mean, he worked in this field and he gets it now. But he's like, when I was there, I'm not really thinking about it. I mean, there's things that don't make sense, that don't add up, and people, but they just keep going about it. It's like, well, this is how the book says to do it.
And I know groupthink isn't a thing, but there is, and what I mean by that more specifically is that, again, what Jordan said earlier, only the individual thinks, but this effect of multiple people being in the same space that have the same accepted presuppositions. So when you start to question things, you look to your left and your right, and you're like, oh, they're not questioning it. I must be wrong then. And I just look to point my head down.
That's right.
I mean, that's what I found in the Army, because even when I was at West, again, I said this to you last night, it's very easy for me to say that I woke up in 2016, but the reality is I was already questioning things before that. I just started questioning a lot more in 2016. Previous to that, I would have the lingering, why here's an example. We were being taught towards the end of my time at West Point that Russia is an aggressor and that China is an aggressor and all these things. And I was looking at Russia specifically, and I'm like, look how many bases we have around Russia. Does Russia have any bases around the US? I'm like, no. How can we call them the aggressor? Right, exactly. So I thought that, but I was like, no, there has to be more to it that I don't know.
They know better.
So I just point my head down. But I did have the lingering questions. But that's the thing. When it comes to scientists or anyone who is entrenched in a dogma that is unproven, is, again, they look to their left and their right, and they see other people aren't questioning it, so they just point their head back down.
And I guess for some reason, like I say, some of us are built to not care about what the group thinks. You just want to know what's actually true. Right. Even if you maybe can't figure that out, you still want to know. And you understand that a lot of things people are saying don't add up. And you feel alone, and a lot of us have felt that way our whole lives. I mean, I feel that way in my own religion. Like, there's things that I believe that the Bible says that are clear, and that if you said that in a church, they would kick you out right away. It is what it is, but I have to go with what I believe. You can't, again, this goes back to belief, which we can tell you have to start with beliefs to ever even get off the ground. I have to believe certain things just to reason. Mm-hmm. If I believe these things about the scientific method, even if I think it can't do what it claims, but if that's the best standard you have for cause and effect, people should be at least trying. Yeah. You would think, but it's like they don't even try. And that's what always bothered me with virology. And now that I've looked into some other topics, the other thing I wanted to say about the scientific method, a lot of people will be like, scientific method has nothing to do with proving the existence of something. Existence comes first, right? Mm-hmm. You can't even, and I've seen a lot of people say that where they hear us talk about scientific method and they'll get on Facebook and be like, prove to me that such and such exists with the scientific method. And I'm like, that's not how it works. No. Like, you got to understand this stuff, that existence of a thing is just existence of a thing. I mean, granted, do people use these indirect means to claim existence of something? Absolutely. We could go down that rabbit trail with, again, nucleotides, molecules, atoms, photons, whatever you want to make it, things that nobody could show you, but yet they'll point to an quote-unquote indirect evidence to claim, and again, that's an affirming and consequent logical fallacy. If photons, then I'll see these blips on a sensor when I do a double slit. I do see these blips, so therefore those must represent photons. It's like, they're macro level blips. Why don't you think that's the particle nobody
can do? A lot of these things are coming from static images. Static images doesn't tell you about objects in motion, but even when it comes to things in motion, you have to appeal to motion to know what motion is.
Emotions, so it's like motion's a whole nother hot topic, right? Like, but this whole indirect evidence stuff bothers me. And I use a lot of examples against that, because you'll see that in some of the Twitter interactions. They'll say, well, we have indirect evidence. It's like, indirect evidence can't tell you the truth. Right. It could only get you probability, but not if your presumed cause doesn't exist. Yeah. The examples I give were urology based, right? I can get a CAT scan and we know it's pretty much 100% sensitive specific for a stone. It's either there, they're that good when it comes to stones. Could I get an ultrasound of somebody and see some swelling on their kidney, but not see the stone and go, well, you might have a stone? Sure, that's a possibility. Could I say there's a tiny gnome hiding in your ureter blocking it? Would people say that's a possibility? I mean, I guess anything's possible, but is that real? Right. No. And so that's the whole, without indirect, you can only compare your indirect evidence to something real, which would be direct evidence. And even then it's not direct. Right. That's the difference, right? I think a lot of things in science, technology rely on this quote unquote indirect evidence, which again, if you understand how that works, it's really just storytelling. Mm-hmm. And people don't like that because, again, their careers depend on it, the things they're doing in the lab. if you ask somebody for proof of a nucleotide or an amino acid, they'll go, well, look at this electrophoresis. And you're like, yeah, that's macroscopic bands on a gel. How do you know those represent a single quote unquote molecule? Well, they can't tell you that. Mm-hmm. They just believe it. Well, that's fine. Again, we're back to beliefs. That's your opinion. But you want to change the world and lock us down and do all these other things for it? Now I'm not okay with it.
And that's the whole point.
That's
exactly.
The point.
That's when we're not okay with it.
That's right.
If you're enjoying this episode, please consider sharing it with at least one friend or family member who you think could benefit from hearing it. You help us grow and reach more people by sharing it with those around you. Also, be sure to head to the show notes to check out our membership offerings, membership marketplace, and more. We all know that Big Ag is poisoning our food supply, and Big Pharma's so-called medicine is straight up poison. What most people aren't aware of, though, is that most supplements are also filled with artificial sweeteners, dyes, GMOs, glyphosate, and a host of other toxic ingredients, even many of the more natural supplements. My good buddy James Benefico dedicated his life to crafting the world's cleanest, most nutritious organic supplements after a pre-workout energy drink caused heart palpitations so severe that he almost landed up in the ER. Organic Muscle was born, revolutionizing sports nutrition by using exclusively non-GMO ingredients from USDA organic farms. Since then, tens of thousands of people, including myself, have leveled up their fitness and their health with Organic Muscle's award-winning natural pre-workout. There's no jitters, no heart palpitations, no itchy skin, just nourishing organic food and herb-based ingredients for clean, sustained energy, strength, endurance, and recovery. Numerous studies have shown that Tonka Ali is the most effective herb in the world for naturally boosting testosterone levels. And we know that testosterone levels are depleting all over the world because of what's put in the food supply, what we're exposed to. Organic Muscle has the world's first fully organic Tonka Ali supplement. I only support and promote things that I actually use, and I can say I legitimately use Organic Muscle products. Use code FORWARD15 at checkout for 15% off at organicmuscle.com. All right, so now I want to get into rationalism. And we already touched on it a little bit by going into some of the logical fallacies. And I think rationalism obviously is a very large topic, so I think it's best to distill it down into something that's practical for those who are listening and watching, and it's like that is by touching on logical fallacies in my mind. So let's touch on logical fallacies and the most common ones that you've come across in various, quote, fields of study. So obviously we've already touched on affirming the consequent,
right. Begging the question, which is assuming the thing you're supposed to be proving, right? That's a common one. And those usually go hand in hand, like we had talked about. People will assume the thing first and then point to an effect to claim proof of the cause that they were supposed to be proving with the effect. You know what I mean? So
and that's how they come up with rescue devices, because they already have the presupposition. So like when you look at the Michelson-Morley experiment, when it comes to trying to prove that the Earth was moving, they were unable to. So that's how they came up with the whole theory of relativity, because they were unable to prove it. Or when you look at virology and or let's say the germ hypothesis and the failed contagion studies, then they come up with, it's antibodies, or they had antibodies to this, they had immunity, et cetera, et cetera.
That's right. You come up with these rescue devices to explain why you're not seeing the things you claim you're supposed to see.
Right.
It's and then you still go, so where was this ever proven? If you can't prove it, how do you know? And you don't ever get it's weird. Affirming the consequent would still be my favorite logical fallacy because it's everywhere. So I do think it's important to recognize that one. Recognize the form, and if you don't see it strictly, you can usually modify a claim and see the structure of the sentence to then put it in that form to see if it's truly legitimate or not. Mm-hmm. Most fallacies, though, that we see are called informal fallacies, like not a form as far as like P's and Q's. They're basically, in the end, it boils down to everything becoming a non sequitur, meaning something you're saying doesn't logically follow from something else. It just doesn't follow.
Do you think a lot of those come from inductive reasoning?
I don't. Probably. I guess I'd never thought about it like that.
Because inductive reasoning, what you're taking one particular and then making a generalized claim surrounding the particular.
You are, but even that inductive reasoning, like, it's still a form of, it's considered a legitimate form of reasoning.
I question whether it's legitimate.
No, I agree. And the only way induction cannot be fallacious is if you can close the induction.
Right.
Meaning, if you're only studying a set, and then you just make a claim about that set, well, then that's fine.
Right.
That's universalized to that set. But if you're trying to universalize it to everything and all times ever, you can't do that because you haven't experienced that. You don't know. Karl Popper gave the black swan example. The black swan is the one where it's like, I can count 1,000 swans that are all white. Does that give me the right to say all swans are white? No, because the 1,001st swan might be black. Right? Like that's induction, and that's used everywhere. And we all kind of operate with that in our heads, but because we don't know for certain, we operate based on probability. Do I know that this chair is going to hold me up every time I sit in it? No, I base it on my past experience that that's what chairs are supposed to do.
Right.
But as far as I think induction.
That's another rabbit trail. Let's set inductive versus deductive reasoning aside. Because there's so much to cover. So let's go back to logical fallacy. Sorry to interrupt.
No, you're good. Non sequiturs are really what most of the informal fallacies, and they all have names, come down to non sequitur. It just means Y doesn't follow from X. Like whatever you just said is not necessitated by the premises. You have different names for these. Obviously, like an ad hominem is one that we're all familiar with. Ad hominem is against the man. It's basically when you say something and somebody just comes back with, you're an idiot, but nothing else. It's not, you're stupid and here's why, and let me give you, then it's not really an ad hominem, even though you're just being a jerk. Yeah. But ad hominem is just where your answer to them is, you're stupid, or your dad is weak, or my dad can beat up your dad, or something just not, you're like, what does that have to do? It always comes down to, what does that have to do with what I was just talking about? Right. Those are non sequiturs. Red herrings. Red herrings are easy, but they're a little tricky. Red herrings is when somebody does answer you, but it's not actually answering what you asked. Yeah. It's they go down a separate rabbit trail that sounds right, but it's not. Straw men, right? Straw man arguments. Those are everywhere, where somebody will claim you said something, or they're building up something in their head that they think you're arguing, and they argue against that, and it's called burning down the straw man. But then you go, I never said that. Like you're building a straw man to fight against that has nothing to do with my argument. Again, it's a non sequitur. It doesn't follow because what I said was this, and you're talking about this over here. Those would be the most common ones. There's other fallacies like equivocation fallacies are huge, where basically you're going back to where somebody's changing the definition of a word even within the same sentence. Like the word means something here and then over here, but they don't mean the same thing. Yep. And that's where you have to be hyper specific on define your terms. Let's get to that first. Otherwise, we're going to talk past each other. And that can be I'm not saying that people that do this are nefarious. We all do it because we may just be misunderstanding what somebody else is saying. Right. Leah and I did this the other night. I showed her a quote and she was like, I don't really agree with that. And I'm like, why don't you agree with it? And she started telling me why. And I'm like, well, that's not actually what he's saying here. It's this. And she's like, oh, okay. Well, if that's what that means, then yes, I agree. And I'm like, see, that's how simple it is. But the minute we already assume that we're, assumptions go a long way, then we can start going this way against each other and you get mad. But the informal fallacies are really they're easy to spot. Usually we see it in Facebook conversations all the time or Twitter conversations.
Reification fallacies.
Reification fallacies would be where, misplaced concreteness, where you give something that's a concept concrete attributes. People love that with models, right? We don't live on models. Models are.
That's why science is also not models.
Unless it's a quote unquote scientific model, which is no different than you've proven something with cause and effect, right? Like, and then you try to model out how that might play out. I think there's problems with that too, but that's not what most people mean when they talk about models. You see this in the flat Earth and globe Earth communities. They're like, "Well, show me your flat Earth model," and it's like, I don't need a model. I don't live on a model. I don't live on a map. Like, that's not how reality works. There's holes in your globe. Show me your globe model. You know what I mean? Like, there's no such thing. I don't know where that came from, but that's a big one. It would be reification fallacy. I can't think. There's so many of them, but again, most of it is just easy to, once you see that one thing said doesn't lead to these conclusions, you can kind of call it out for what it is. But a lot of people don't like that. They get angry with you. Genetic fallacy, huge one. Okay, I wanted to hit that one. Essentially, it's a guilt by association fallacy. This person believes this, and they're wrong there, so therefore anything they say is wrong. Right. It's like that's absurd. I'm not an atheist, but I use Bertrand Russell quotes all the time because I agree with what he said. You know what I mean? It was well said. But a lot of people hate that. You got to be careful with that kind of stuff because we all can tend to do that just because it's this emotional response against a person. It's kind of an ad hominem, essentially. It's like, I don't like that person, therefore anything they say is wrong. Right. And you get into the weeds with that in like courtroom, this all goes into like courtroom evidences, right? Because everything in the courtroom is pretty much fallacious.
Yeah.
It's inductive, it's hearsay, it's guilt by association. That's when you get a character witness, right? And they say, oh, his character's bad, therefore we can't trust his testimony. That doesn't logically follow, right? Just because he might have done this, this, and this doesn't mean he's lying about this. Should you be careful and cautious? Absolutely. We should be discerning no matter what. Again, we're talking about logic here. Strict logic, meaning one thing necessarily follows from the other.
You know what's so interesting about that, though? I don't want to go off on a tangent on the courtroom thing, but this is a maxim of law. The burden of proof lies on the claimant. That's
right.
supposed to have been
That's right.
a maxim of law, at least. And I'm not saying that still stands in courtrooms today, especially with like the kangaroo courts that we have now. But the point is that's supposed to be a maxim of law, that the burden of proof lies on the individual making the positive claim.
No different than what we say with these other things.
Right.
And that's another fallacy, right? The burden of proof reversal. We get it all the time. Is that they'll try to make their claim and then you kind of ask them questions and then they'll turn it around on you and go, well, you tell me what's going on. Or you
where's your proof
this.
that a virus doesn't exist?
Right. It's like, first of all, you can't prove non-existence. Second of all, I'm not making claims here. You are. You should, we just know that. It's like, yeah, if you're claiming it, you kind of got to show me something.
Right.
So this is where the informal fallacies come in, and they're once you just kind of learn a few of them, and they're easy to spot. And I'm not saying we need to go around and all the time be calling people out with the names of fallacy. It gets old, but if you recognize it in your head, that's important. Just because then you realize maybe that you're talking to somebody that hadn't really thought through what they're saying.
It refines the way that you think.
Yep.
Like that's what I found as I've adopted looking at other people's arguments and seeing the logical fallacies in them. It's made me really want to refine the way that I present material. And do I always present it? And like I do it on this podcast where I'll say something and it is something that I believe, but I will pass it off as something that, I know as a fact, right? And it's because the way that I've set up my podcast is it's a casual conversation like this, right? So it's a tough one. But the point is like when it's useful when, again, people are trying to force or coerce or manipulate you to adopt a certain lifestyle or set of beliefs and wanting you to fall under their authority. That's when it's very useful to use.
No, I totally agree. It is useful in everyday conversation, but you don't need to always terminate friendships because somebody's using a fallacy. It's like we're humans. We're all fallible. We all do this stuff. It's not like there's this set of us that are perfect. We all do it. We all make errors in thinking. The key is to try to spot it when you do it or before you do it and then go, whoa, let me back up and rethink that before I do that all the time. I'll find myself sometimes responding in a more of an emotional way and I'll literally just delete everything I type and go, you know what, that was not a good way. Even if I might have been right, I'm throwing things in that don't have anything to do with what they said because you want to jab
come across
people.
condescending.
Yes.
Bit.
And I know that I do that. Like I'm horrible when it comes to typing, especially with people that aren't intellectually honest. You just want
That's when it gets tough too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm getting better, but anyway, side topic. Sometimes it's better just to not say anything.
It's also a good exercise, honestly, to get it all out and then just like, okay, I've gotten it out now. Now I'm just going to delete it.
Said that the other day to Leah. I was like, I typed for like 7 or 8 minutes. She's like, man, you're really going to town. I'm like, oh yeah. And I had it all and I was like, delete. And I just felt better.
Yeah.
Because I was able to think through what I was thinking about by typing it out. And then I was like, you know what? Me saying it to this person isn't actually going to help anything, but I got it out. So,
And it's interesting because when you come across someone that is behaving in an intellectually honest way, you then do naturally want to refine your communication style because you're like, oh, this is a person that is actually inquiring about this and genuinely wants to know. So I want to be very careful about how I'm communicating.
That's right.
with them.
Don't become a hypocrite and act like the people that you rail against in other places. Because it's easy to do if you're put on the spot. And that's why I'm careful making positive claims. Because once I do, I know that burden of proof is on me. So I need to have something to back that up. That's why I usually more ask questions of other people, like, how do you know that? Can you walk me through that? Things like that. And a lot of people you'll find just can't do it. And that's a sign that they've never thought it through. And that's okay. It depends on how you leave it with them. You can go at them or you can just go, fair enough, leave it at that.
Right. So. I want to circle back real quick to the genetic fallacy, then I want to move on to how we know anything, which is a huge question. But the genetic fallacy, the guilt by association, can that also work the other way? Let's say as an example, Alex Jones believes in gun rights. You believe in gun rights, therefore you must agree with everything that Alex Jones says.
We do this. People do this to me all the time. I'll say something against who is it, Biden or something stupid. I'll just make a joke. They're like, oh, you must love Trump. And then I'll say something against the Republicans. Oh, you must love Biden. It's like, you can't escape the fact that I'm talking about that one person. I didn't say, again, that's more of a straw man. That's what that is.
Yeah.
And these are all related because
Yeah.
they're all non sequiturs.
Yep.
So you can't really always break them apart like we're talking about into these separate categories because they're all kind of variations on a theme.
Mhm.
It's no. I didn't say anything about Trump. I'm not political. I'm an anarcho-capitalist. What are you talking? You know what I mean? But they need to pigeonhole you into that category so that they can push you aside,
Right.
essentially, because it's something that they don't agree with, and they go, I'm going to put him in that category. They don't have to deal with him.
Right.
And instead of going, let me deal with you on your terms and what you're talking about specifically. And this happens in conversations about politics and government all the time.
The same thing comes to when they find out that we are people who question the globe. They automatically categorize us.
Flat
And
earth.
that's why it's like there's several people that we know that, and I've not been super outspoken about that, but yeah, I absolutely question the globe.
Yep.
Like I question their claims. And then after that, I don't know what it is. I have
Agreed.
no idea. I just know that it is easy to demonstrate that their claims are false. Right.
Correct.
And there are people that we know who don't even want to say that publicly. And I totally get it, honestly, because if you're trying to help people come to the light, so to speak, on some of these other topics, flat earth has been so effectively demonized that if you're associated with that, then they're not going to take anything else you say seriously. But then that is also still a logical fallacy. It's a genetic fallacy.
That's right. Bingo. And I hate that stuff. I'm like, how dare you try to, because you'll do it in conversation. You'll say something about one thing and they go, oh, you're a flat earther too? It's like, that has nothing to do with what we're talking about.
Nothing.
Even if I am, so what?
Right.
But in their mind, they're like, well, he's an idiot. Therefore, everything he says is stupid. And it's like, it's just such poor thinking.
Yeah.
And that's what we're talking about here is like, just learn to stop and take a breath and think about the exact thing somebody's saying. It doesn't matter if you don't agree with 99% of whatever they're talking about in that situation, evaluate it on its own terms.
Yeah.
That's it. And just be honest. Be an honest, decent person,
Yeah, man. Yeah. Before we get to the how do we know anything, I want to ask you, because you're an MD, and I guess I could say the same thing, like looking at someone as a professional, went to an esteemed university, blah, blah, blah. I'm a West Point graduate. Yep. And what makes us unique in that we came from that professional academia realm, and we are still willing to say, nope, it doesn't matter. I'm on the pursuit of what is true, irrespective of if I'm cast aside by society, irrespective of whether, people are going to deem me as unserious, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just on the pursuit of what is true. What makes us different?
I don't know. Because again, you get back to when we talked about this at dinner last night, like your base temperament and how you're made. And there seem to be certain different categories and the thing is, the things we're strong in, we're weak in other things that we see in other people. And we're like, why can't I think like that? And so we have no reason to boast about it or anything. No. It just is. I can't give you a reason. Why? This gets into the whole, why do you do anything at all? How do you know anything at all? Why do you make the choices that you make? Right? Mm-hmm. We get into the whole free will debate. And it's like, well, I can't free will myself to suddenly not believe things I believe.
Right.
And I can't tell you even why I necessarily believe, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't work like that. So I don't know the answer, but it is, I think people do gravitate.
Oh, that's a thing now?
Oh yeah. Towards like,
we need to figure out different terms for some of these things.
People see that we came from these kind of more mainstream areas and we're still willing to question. And I think that for some reason that helps them. I don't know why. Again, it's like, you shouldn't worry about what other consensuses are thinking.
Yeah.
But it's just human nature. And they're like, okay, so that's a doctor asking a question. I guess it's okay for me to ask that question. It's like, I wish people wouldn't think like that. I never appeal to being an MD for anything unless it's, ever. Even when I'm doing things, I'm like, don't believe me because I'm an MD. Yeah. Like, this is my opinion. Go look it up, look into it. But there's that whole side of like, people want somebody else to sort of go to. I just never really have been, I guess, in a way, although we all want to find our tribe. We do.
This is the thing that I was just wrestling with in my head right now, and I've thought about it before, is like, for example, when it comes to the shape of this realm, right? even in the much of the health freedom, even amongst just the terrain subset of the health freedom crowd, there's a lot of people who look at that as like, ew, like you believe in that. And as I was really starting to look into the claims for the globe, I was really wrestling with that. Like, I'm starting to really think that the globe is totally unproven, right? And, in some ways you could say disproven, but point is, like, this is clearly not what it is.
Right.
And man, but I've fallen into this crowd, especially after the last 4 years, that like I feel accepted in this space. And if I start speaking about this, then other people are going to throw me aside. That's
right.
And it's like, nah, F it, I'm doing it. I'm going there.
Yep. Same.
And it's like, there's a freedom in that. And there's at least when I see someone else doing that, I'm like, wow, that dude is truly free.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's liberating and also lonely at the same time. But I just feel like if you really care about intellectual honesty, you will apply that everywhere. My whole thing is, if you're being inconsistent somewhere, your worldview is wrong somewhere, because consistency is a test of a word. It doesn't mean your worldview is true, but if you're inconsistent, it's going to falsify. Right? We're back to that. So you have to be consistent. And I want to be. And when I am being inconsistent, I want somebody to tell me, hold me accountable, say, dude, hey, you're big on logic. You just committed. And I'm going to be like, I mean, for me, it would be crushing because I'm like, I don't ever want to do that. I mean, really, because I'm a type 1 enneagram, like black and white. I mean, that's just who I am.
Right.
Where some people are like, oh, yeah, whatever. I mean, you see all the time, some people don't give a crap about being fallacious. I'll point out the fallacy. I'll call it. I'll show it to them. They're like, they don't care. They just double down. And it is what it is. Then again, we might as well just part ways at that point. But it is funny how you do, in this space especially, I have had so much hate because I'll be saying these things in groups and it's like, oh, yeah, about viruses. And then the minute some kind of topic comes up about NASA or the Earth, and I'll be like, yeah, that's a legit question. And they're like, oh, you one of them flat earthers? And they just write you off. And I'm like, see ya. It is what it is. I'm not going to change because I'm worried about what you think about me.
No.
Even though we all do care about what people think about us in a way, you can't escape it. But I think for these kind of topics, you have to be willing to be consistent and just be honest.
Well, there's caring about what someone thinks of you, and then there's forming an identity around what someone thinks of you. And there's a big difference between the two.
I totally agree. Yep. Good point.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna keep kicking the can down the road on like how do we know anything, because there's some other things that I want to talk about too. This kind of deals with inductive reasoning versus deductive reasoning, and it's like taking a universal down to a particular versus taking a particular down to a universal. Can you explain the difference between the two and the flaws associated with them?
I mean, it makes sense in your head, right? Like deductive reasoning is going from a universal. Think of it in like Venn diagrams. You've already got the big one, so it's easy to then go into the smaller ones inside that. That just makes sense in people's head. The problem is when all you have is small, and then you're trying to extrapolate to some larger unknown. That how do you know it? You can't do that. And it's the same thing induction when it comes to like the black swan example I gave, right? Like going from particulars to universals. It's the same thing with morality or descriptive things and trying to make ought claims out of them or morality claims out of them. And you just can't do that. You can't take descriptive and then universalize it at all. And you sure as heck can't universalize it to a morality claim, because here's how to think about this. In logic, you can't have more information in your conclusions than was there in the beginning in your premises. This is why I hate the quote unquote arguments for the proofs of the existence of God. I hate them.
Yeah.
The cosmological argument, the teleological argument from design, all these things. The best they might get you to is some type of creator generic. That's it. Maybe, at best. I mean, even Richard Dawkins admitted that. He's like, yeah, well, aliens created us. I mean, you can just go there and you're like, that's actually legit. It could be, because it's like, because nothing in that argument.
Well, no, I'm just laughing at Richard Dawkins having said that.
I know.
Like,
he actually admitted, you could argue for creation, but he's going to go the alien route, right? Like, whatever. Bro. The point is, you can't, and you can start applying this when you see people drawing these big assumptions or conclusions, and you go, how did you get there? Again, you're back to how did you get to that? Because nowhere in your premises did you have that. Right. It's the same thing with making claims about the shape of the ground based on what lights in the sky are doing. That's a non sequitur, right? There's nothing in what's going on in the sky that I don't even know what those are that has anything to do with the shape of the ground, unless I first beg the question of the story I'm given. So same thing.
You see that happen all the time too. People will say, why would this one be in the shape of be flat if the other ones, and it's like you're already assuming there are other
it's in their
ones.
words, other what, right? Other what? What are you talking about? Other light in the sky? How am I living on a light in the sky?
Right.
Why did you assume that? I mean, I can look at leaves on the trees. Do I live on a giant leaf? Like it's just absurd. But the reason they do it is because they're already assuming the story is true, and they're already identifying with it. So then it's like, well, of course that we live on that because that's what the story tells me, right? But going back to like induction, it's sort of more that's what statistics is about. But again, and that's why I hate statistics. I used to tell patients this all the time. Doc, what are my chances? It's like, I have no idea. Chance doesn't tell you anything about what's going to happen to you as an individual. It's looking back and just collating things, picking some averages and some standard deviations. Why? Because they chose that. Why not the median versus the mean? Anyway, different topic. But
and that could be like a small subset of people too.
Yes.
You have no clue if that applies to every single person.
And you still don't know all the variables that were involved in somebody's life. Like so much research is done with lots of money to form conclusions that may literally have nothing to do with reality. And it's very frustrating. Right. And I understand the reasons for it, especially if you start looking at the money side of things, to market drugs and do all these other, whatever it is, market a product. Because a lot of things just come in the end to money and marketing. But as far as induction goes, that's where you're going to get more of the observational stuff, the statistical studies, all those kind of things, trying to extrapolate small subsets to universal principles. And it's not logical. You can't do that. Same thing with morality. We talked about this last night at dinner. You can't derive morals from looking at things, from descriptions. That's why I hate the term natural law. And I didn't like that when I first heard it. I think it was Jim Bob that said it a few years ago, and he started railing against the term natural law. And I was like, but the reason I didn't like it is I know what we mean when we say natural law.
Yeah, we're talking about like the morality that is innate to human beings.
We are.
But we're trying to apply it to all of nature. I'm like, do you follow the Instagram account Nature is Metal? Because that's what happens in nature.
That's right. And again, just look at human nature. Look at what humans do to each other. Well, the spectrum is broad. So which one is right, which one is wrong? I can't derive that unless I'm given objective morality. This is right, this is wrong. Some people say it's innate. That's fine because they believe it. Well,
that goes back to like what you said that, I don't know if you've said it on this yet. We've already covered so much ground today, but I think you at least said it last night, is that you believe, and I love that you emphasize, I believe this, that we are sort of, I don't like the word encoded because that implies computer, like mechanistic, endowed or imbued with these certain set of innate principles, let's say. That human beings are.
Ideas, principles, knowledge that you can't even like prove that you know, but we just all know.
Just deep down somewhere,
Well, it's no different than like, this is where I get into the weeds with like, okay, I think empirical stuff, it can't do what it claims, but can I know that I'm sitting in a room right now with you? Can I know it infallibly? I believe it. You know what I mean? And if we don't...
We have to have a starting point.
We have to have a start. If you and I don't even agree that we're having a conversation, why are we having a conversation? Right? So then you get back to consensus reality, and you're like, okay, so how do you avoid the subjectivity part? And you just spin your head in circles with that. Because if you don't have a common ground to start from, that we both believe we're in a literal world, physical, and having this conversation, because you'll see these like atheists go, well, how do I know I'm not just a brain in a jar, bro? And I'm like, I guess you don't, but you don't live like that. Right. Well, nobody does, right? In just the same way that materialists can't account.
What does your heart ache when you see something that most would agree is like, that's wrong? Why do you feel love when you see something that others would agree is really good?
But they'll come up with, well, it's just chemicals in motion. That give me, you know what I mean? And I lack those chemicals.
I don't buy that. I just
agree.
Don't buy that.
Well, again, if you get into argumentation, logic, materialism can't account for anything. We talked about that last night. Like if the words coming out of my mouth right now are from random chemical interactions, there's no right or wrong with that. That just is. And it's no different than what yours are. And my random words are no better or worse than your random words. So we might as well not be talking.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
So all that stuff, rabid materialism, I think, and empiricism falls flat. And that's why you ended up with this whole other category, which are called like the rationalists, right?
Yeah.
Of when it comes to philosophy. The problem with rationalism is, again, and we need to define our terms here, because I wanted to say this earlier. A lot of people, when they talk about logic and rational, they have equivocated with what those mean. Most people nowadays, when they'll just say something, they go, well, that's not logical. They're not talking about formal logic. They mean, that doesn't make sense to me, or I don't agree with that. Same thing with the word rational. Well, it's just rational, meaning It's what I want to believe or what makes sense in my head. It's not has nothing to do with formal logic. And when I talk about rationalism and logic, I'm talking about logic, rules of logic, rules of thinking, law of identity, law of excluded middle, like all these things, right? Because if you don't have that in place, nothing else you say matters. Like if you're using fallacies everywhere. But the rationalist side of philosophy, and I'm not an expert on this stuff. I've just kind of dipped my toes in it on like the layman side of things to just try to understand the differences. And with rationalists, you're looking at people like Plato, Descartes, those kind of guys. Funny thing about Descartes, people know this saying, like, I think, therefore I am, right? Like that's the famous saying. And the reason, because Descartes was kind of like us, he was trying to boil down, how do I know anything for certain? What can I know for certain? So what he did was he went through and eliminated everything he thought he couldn't know for certain, and he ended up with thinking that he knows for sure that he's thinking, and therefore because he's the thinking being, he must therefore exist. The problem is, if you're already thinking, of course you have to exist first. So it's sort of a little fallacy, but here's the problem. If all your foundation is I exist, that's the only premise you can know, where else can you go?
Right.
You're still locked in your mind.
100%.
So either way, with empiricism, you're locked in your mind. With pure rabid rationalism, with logic only, because logic doesn't furnish you with any premises.
Well, here's the thing, too, is that both empiricism and rationalism, whether they want to admit it or not, proponents of those schools of thought, of which, like, I am in part, let's say, their starting point is a belief. Their starting point is still a belief. Right. And it's so funny because people who are highly skeptical and sort of in that school of thought that would consider themselves atheists will point to those of us who believe in God and like sort of go, haha, like you believe in God. How do you know? I'm like, your starting point is still a belief as well.
Well, here's the thing. Think about what they say. If they say, all knowledge comes through sensation. Did that knowledge come through sensation? What sensation gave you that knowledge?
Right.
It's self-refuting on its face, right? So you kind of go,
no sensation gave you that.
That's right. And it's the same thing when you ask for, they're like, what's your evidence? And you go, what's your evidence for evidence? You know what I mean? You're still back in the infinite regress is inescapable. So, and that's what I wanted to talk about with philosophy. That's the big issue with the whole epistemology. How do you know anything at all? Because you can keep asking, how do you know that? But how do you know that? And if you want to avoid infinite regress because you never reach your starting point, you have a few options. Circular reasoning. A is true because of B is true because of A, and then and you'll see people with exquisite, long, all the way to double A, triple A, but eventually they come back around to A, B in there, and that's where you get like again, these proofs for God. They always they sneak in what they're supposed to be proving. You can't do that, not logically. But if you want to avoid circular reasoning, you're left with one other choice, and that is foundationalism, which is everyone has to choose their starting point. You have to choose an axiom to ever get started. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think it was Augustine who said, I believe so that I may understand. Mm-hmm. Most people would not, they go, no, I have to understand something before I can believe it. Mm-mm. You have to first believe something before you can ever actually start reasoning. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of does a mind job on you, but if you really think hard about it, it's true.
Even the belief that like you have to understand something, that's a belief.
Again, I sent you that video, a month or two ago.
The problem of criterion.
Problem of the criterion, which honestly is no different. It's just a fancy way of still going back to how do I avoid infinite regress? Right. How do I know that I know that I know? If I have to have a method to know something, how do I know that my method is correct? You know what I mean? Like you're in this endless loop. And I don't have the right answer. And this was my presentation at the church conference I went to last weekend. And it was for Christians because I wanted them to understand when people put them on the spot about, well, how do you know the Bible's true? It's okay to say you believe it because the people arguing against you can't knock you for that because they do the same thing. Right. We all do it. We have to. Even if we don't know what our starting axiom is, we all have one. It's just like geometry. You have to start with unproven axioms because if you could prove your axiom, that would be your axiom. You know what I mean? You have to start somewhere. And there's a whole school of philosophy dedicated. If this wasn't a real issue, you wouldn't have people debating it for thousands of years. It's a real issue. How do you know that you can know anything at all? Yeah. And if you look up the definition of knowledge, you'll get, justified true belief. That's the philosophical definition. And you're like, so what justifies it? How do you know that you're justification? You know what I mean? You can always go back to how do you know that you know that? Right. It's so frustrating, but if anybody wants to look it up, it's called Munchausen's trilemma, and it's a little graph, and it just goes down bare bones. What is the issue with this? and you get the three things. You get infinite regress on one side, circularity, foundationalism. Those are your three choices. Yeah. And it's just like, it's frustrating because it's like, we don't like that. We want to know.
Right.
But
well, this goes back to sort of a difference in, let's say, just, I don't know how to put this, like meta framework or philosophy on life or approach to life, if you will, that I think both you and I and other people we're friends with have that others haven't seemed to adopt, is that one, we are okay with not knowing. Like, you see, I'm laughing this whole podcast. It's not because this is like blowing my mind. I'm like, oh my God, like we can't know anything. I've already wrestled with this too.
Right.
But it's that like, this is hilarious. Like we can't really know anything, but that's the whole point, I think, is just to be in the pursuit of it. Right. Yeah. And be in love with the process of perpetually peeling back all the things that are clearly not true. Yeah. And then what you're left with, again, is not objective truth, but it's closer to it, possibly. Maybe. Let's say maybe.
That's another pet peeve of mine, because when somebody says, "Well, we're closer to the truth," well, to say you're closer, you have to know what the truth is.
I know, and that's
like saying I'm closer to Dallas. Where's Dallas? Well, if you don't know where Dallas is, how do you know you're closer?
And that's why I said maybe.
I know what you mean, though. I do know what you mean, because there is beauty in peeling back falsehoods.
Yes, it's peeling back falsehoods, and I think what you're left with, it represents something that is more true, possibly.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's a conundrum. It really is. And again, that goes to why, and I can't explain to somebody like why I believe what I believe with the Bible and all that, like, because I get it. Like, and because people want an argument, they want to know why they should believe it. And it's like, I can't give that to you. Yeah. I can't, because I'm not going to appeal to history. Like a lot of Christians do that. They're like, look at these evidences. It's like, let's go back into the fallacies real quick. Don't do that. It drives me nuts. You can do it if you want to, whatever. Yeah. I used to buy into that stuff. Yeah. I read these books, the Lee Strobel, Case for Christ, and all this stuff. And it's just like, yeah, that sounds great. But again, you don't know any of that. And even if you're appealing to evidence, it's still an affirming the consequent fallacy in the end. We can't avoid faith, and because that's how I equate it. People think faith is a bad word. We all have faith in things. 100%. The majority of things we think we know, we either heard from somebody else, we read it in a textbook, we believe it because we think the source was trustworthy. Well, why? Right. How do you know? You know what I mean? Like, you can't avoid this issue even in everyday life.
Right.
So it's
the being okay with not knowing, and then also being willing to go against any grain. Like, even, like I said, I could have landed in the terrain camp and just stayed there. And I'm like, nope, there's some deeper things here that I want to explore.
My problem with terrain camp was a lot of them were making some of the same mistakes that the germ theory camp makes. They're making the positive claims that they can't actually back up. That puts them on the defense at that point and on the spot against the germ theory people that are not going to think anymore about their own issues. They're going to go, hey, you're making claims now. Of course, they're being hypocrites because they... But it's just human nature.
It's so tough because, like, when I present on this topic as an example, I do go into Eileen McCusick's work, Veda Austin's work, but, and there's a huge but, and I do put a disclaimer, or I'll say the disclaimer. Everything I'm going to say after I have just falsified the entire paradigm of virology and the germ hypothesis is my opinion. Based on some other things that I've come across. Have these been empirically tested? Have they been proven? Absolutely not.
Right.
But here's some other ideas and plausible explanations for what may be the cause of the phenomenon.
There's nothing wrong with speculating if you're admitting that you're speculating.
Yes.
Because that's fun. I mean, we could sit around and do that forever.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what philosophy really is. I hate to say it. It's guys sitting around. Go read a good history of philosophy sometime. You're going, there's a million different stories going on here, and all these guys thought they were right, but they made it up because they weren't furnished any premises. They kind of just assumed them, and then they went from there. And that's, again, we get down to, do you have to have revelation to truly know anything? Revelation from your creator. If there's an omniscient being, surely only the truth could come from an omniscient being. Because if I don't know everything and how everything interacts with everything, can I know anything at all?
Goes back to the painting example, right? Like the only one who can make sense and know the whole story behind the painting is the one who painted it.
Yeah. And you could take it to some simple claim like the climate change people. I mean, I remember asking this question probably 15 years ago on a Facebook comment. Somebody said something about the temperature of the earth has changed 2 degrees in so many years. And I go, were you given the proper thermostat setting for the earth? How do you know what it ought to be? Right? We're back to the ought claim.
Yeah.
You're taking an is and they're sneaking in an ought. And you will see this all the time. You will see people act like morality is not a real thing. Ethical claims are everywhere. People constantly, whether it's like veganism or it's eating carnivore diet, or it's climate change, whatever it is, ethics is everywhere. But the problem is people will appeal to what is to try to make a claim about what ought to be, and you cannot do that. Yeah. You have to have a reason for your ought claim.
Can you expand on that with other examples?
Well, again, we go back to history. Like, you just take history for an example, and somebody says, this is what so-and-so, this is what the barbarians did in this time period. And, but yet they were killing people, but that's wrong. And you're like, why is it wrong? Or they were killing people, and so that's obviously okay because they were doing it. It's like, so because they were doing it, descriptive, that means it's okay, morality, and then most people go, well, no, it's not okay. See the disconnect, right? Like, you can't get an ought from an is. And that is, and it's the same thing in my Christian friends, like, or non-Christian friends, where they try to like attack the Bible because it describes some horrific thing. It's like, yeah, horrific things happen every day. This was a description. It's not
prescribing.
It's not prescribing it. It's just saying this is what happens because you're dealing with, we're all wicked people. We all do stupid crap, and a lot of us do really evil stuff. But just by saying it's evil means you're already presupposing an ethic. You know what I mean? Like, so just teasing these things out, that is the point of all this. It's not that we're going to come to these grand conclusions necessarily. It's analyze your own way of thinking when you're dealing with these topics or when you're reading somebody, so it helps you respond to them better. It might just help you ask questions but in a better way to make them think, and it helps you think along the way.
Yeah.
So that was sort of where I was going with that. I don't know where I was going on a tangent for a minute with that, but back to the whole like rationalism thing real quick it's just important that, because a lot of that came out of like, I think the Enlightenment and all that, but it was this strict rationalism where they thought logic alone could furnish them with the truths of the world. And that just doesn't work because logic doesn't give you any truth claims, any propositions. Propositions come from elsewhere. Only propositions can be true or false. Pictures can't be true or false. Words can't be true or false. Only a proposition is. And that's important too. Because when somebody's like, is this picture true or not? And you're like, that doesn't even make sense.
Right. And logic is still being applied in the context of, really, I see a lot of crossover between empiricism and logic too, because, or empiricism and rationalism, because ultimately it is still based in what we can experience here, what we can think about what we're experiencing here.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I'm not claiming that, because
I'm talking about when I say here, just to clarify, I mean like what we can observe and feel with our senses and see, because we're still, when it comes to logic, in many ways appealing to empiricism in many ways.
Yes, and I'm not denying my heroes in this regard were Gordon Clark and John Robbins, and they were Christian philosophers, and they went so far that they conflated the philosophy of empiricism with sensation in general, to the point where they would deny that anything you seek is actually there. It's like, so now you're your own worst enemy because now you're in skeptic land. And that bothered me a lot. And then the more I've thought about that stuff over the years, that's where I think they went off the rails. I think they didn't understand that, no, we have to, because some of the examples they would give would be like, well, there's hallucinations. Well, what does a hallucination presuppose? That there's a real thing that's not a hallucination that you can know. Otherwise, how would you know if it's a hallucination or not? Or a mirage. They'd always appeal to mirages. Well, of course, sensations aren't always reliable. There's a difference between me looking here and seeing a camera over there and me trying to make grand claims about secrets of the universe that I can't see or know or touch, or secrets of history or things. That's the difference in my mind. I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
Like, I know where they were going with that, because people would ask him, like, Dr. Clark, do you even know that you're married to your wife? And he's like, she could be a clone. And I'm like, that's true. But you know what I'm saying? Like, you can 100%. Take it too far, but to the point of denying that you're even in an external world, again, you're back into solipsism, where you're just a mind somewhere that exists. Nobody lives like that. So that's sort of my dividing line, because I used to be real confused on this stuff until the last maybe year or two.
Well, it's interesting too, because this crosses over with the people who say, I shared this last night, that I would consider myself a panentheist. I think that's the correct word. And it's like someone, and again, I emphasize here, belief, someone who believes that God is an omnipresent,
omnipotent, omniscient,
being that is distinct, but I am also fundamentally an aspect of it, right? And that's kind of what I believe. But there are those who will say that, oh, the universe is all one thing modulating itself in an infinite universe is also a funny one. But
yeah, I was gonna ask, what's the universe?
Yeah, the realm is what we know is all one thing modulating itself in an infinite number of unique ways. And I'm like, you know what? Yeah. That's where I like, yes, I think that at some level, but I'm still here. Like I'm still here experiencing.
Yep.
I'm very clearly sitting across from you and I'm different than you. So whether I have that as my foundational starting point, that's fine. And that is my foundational starting point.
Right.
But I'm still here experiencing this.
Exactly.
Like, so I don't live like that.
Yep.
That gives me a contextual foundational belief to approach my life. And that's, for me, I approach it more lovingly. And I'm like, oh, because they are an aspect of God and I'm also an aspect of God, I want to behave more lovingly to them.
Well, the Christian would say that's the image of God in man. That's why we actually care about murder and doing and harming our fellow man, because we're all made in God's image, whatever that means. Now, people have different ideas about what that. Some people say it's logic. God
has a white beard?
Right,
Like that's not what it means.
No, not a physical image. It's some kind of either function or like I said, some people think it's logic. It's how our minds are structured after God's, because God's not insane. Right. God doesn't think 2 + 2 = 5. Right. And because if that's the case, then we can't know anything. Right. I mean, in my opinion. I was going to go somewhere with that topic too, and I forgot, because you were just bringing up some really good points about like panentheism and things like that. Like the whole all is one, it's just self-refuting. Yeah. Then if all is one, then who are you talking right now? You know what I mean? Like it doesn't even make sense.
Like, and again, that's like, yes, that could be in one context a good foundational framework, but I've even had people present to me, if all is one, why can't I just kill you right now? Whatever. Bingo. Like, it doesn't matter. I'm like, see, this is where it's like, you have to admit that this is a belief and admit that, like, for you, this is what I think about this belief.
And what you just said is also important. I wanted to touch on it with worldview issues, is if you can take somebody's claims and show where they contradict and basically cut their own feet out from under them, a lot of people that are honest will go, okay, I can't think that way anymore. A lot of them won't. They won't recognize their own worldview contradicts itself. But a lot of people will, and that's the beauty of what we call apologetics, defenses. Like, I can't prove to you Christianity. What I could do is take certain worldview claims, take them to their logical endpoints, to the point where they are absurd, and go, that doesn't work. Doesn't mean I know the truth necessarily. I believe it, but I can show where yours is self-refuting. And when you can show things that are self-refuting, I think there's power in that. And for people who care about that stuff, they appreciate it too. They're like, okay, wait, I've been thinking about that the wrong way. It's no different when people say, you shouldn't judge. And I'm like, what'd you just do? Like, you just made a judgment, right? Like, it's self-refuting. Like, those are fun, honestly. I love that kind of stuff because they're easy to spot. Now, there's some that are nuanced that are harder to spot, like the whole all is one. There was, what's the opposite? Heraclitus he was like one of the early philosophers, supposedly, and nothing was ever the same. You never step in the same river twice. You're every moment is different. It's like, then who are you? Is there a you? How do you, you're still talking about something, you know what I'm saying? So this goes down the whole problem between the one and the many, and like, particular versus universals. Like, you could get in the weeds with that stuff.
And that's where you really, like, an intellectually honest person, like you'll say, will admit that it is a belief. And if there is contradictions, they'll have to go back and refine. So when someone presented to me like, well, if all is one, then I'll just kill you because you're just an aspect of me that'll come back. And it's like, I feel that that's wrong. And it's like, okay, well, then I have to go back and re-examine this. And for me, that's what I've done. I'm like, I believe the foundational starting point is that there is a God who is supreme, right? And that is loving, a fundamentally like loving God that is, wanting us to engage in loving ways too. Right. And we are fundamentally an aspect of it, but it is still supreme over us. And that's where I've adopted like panentheism, where it's like both inextricably linked to God, but God is also a supreme entity that is distinct and separate of us.
Right. And there's tons of philosophers that talk about that, about the God being, because a lot of philosophies, they either end up one extreme or the other, where God is so other that there's no connection, or God is so one that you're just one, you end up with and so you can get the weeds with a lot of that stuff. Totally, and you know what I'm saying? But that's exactly what you're talking about here. You have these extremes, and I'm not saying there's always a false dichotomy, but that's usually the issue with that. But yeah, man, it's a fun, it's a good exercise to go through this stuff, even if you don't really come to some truth belief. it's still exercise in how not to think.
Yeah.
You know,
And I shared this last night too, is I don't even like the word belief, because for me that implies that it's like conditioned. But then can I really say that any of them aren't partially conditioned? I don't know. I honestly don't know, because I could say that this comes from my inner knowing, and it's easy to say that, but how do I know that this isn't coming from something that was impressed upon me like subconsciously that's deep down in there? But I agree. This is where it can lead one into sort of a pessimistic, nihilistic worldview. And how do we prevent ourselves from going there?
I don't know a great answer to that, other than if you truly believe in your foundation that you just know, you have to stick with that. Because again, if you don't, if you end up with just saying, I can't know anything at all, that's a knowledge claim. So you've already refuted yourself. Yep. And then you go, but how do I know that? You know what I'm saying? You end up in, even in your own mind, if you end up in that prison, refuting your own belief at that point. So it's like, I can't escape it. And you almost have to rest comfortably in that inner testimony of what you just believe to be true. And I know that sounds kind of woo-woo.
No, I don't think it does though. I think that's legit, man.
I know. I'm thinking about what the materialists would think, but you know what? I don't care.
Yeah, who cares?
They have to wrestle with
very few
this.
materialists are going to listen to this.
And they have to wrestle with that. I mean, that's why I do appreciate good philosophy, and philosophers will, at least they like to talk about this stuff because they're honest about it. And because these are real issues that everyone, if you take it to it, think hard enough about it, you will end up here in these places. But you do have to rest on your foundations. You just really do. And mine is Scripture. I mean, it really is. That is my starting point, and I try to deduce from there. Does that mean I'm going to be able to know Chinese history? No. Is that okay? Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Like, because that bothers a lot of my fellow Christians. Like, well, if I can't truly know, if I can only know what's there in the Bible, because that's God's word and it's infallible, can't be wrong because He's God. Well, that means I can't truly know all this other stuff. And I'm like, that's okay, because we still can live our lives with opinions about all this stuff, and we can say, you know what, I don't know. Yeah. And there, like you say, there is freedom in saying, I don't know. Yes. I had a friend recently, or I have a friend, they call him the blue collar scholar. He loves the Bible. He knows it better than anybody ever know. He works for UPS. He's not a true scholar. He's not getting paid, but brilliant guy. But he would get in the weeds with people on Facebook trying to give alternative explanations when he'd kind of prove their points wrong, but yet they'd be like, well, then what is it? And he'd kind of concoct some stuff. And I told him, Bob, it's okay to not know. Like, we can say, here's my opinion on what this means. I don't know for sure. And he was like, this is like a whole new world of freedom for me. And I'm like, I know. It's just, I mean, really, because if you're stuck in this, I always have to provide some alternative explanation. And I told him what we always say, falsification does not demand a replacement, because that's a burden of proof reversal, right? So there's freedom in being able to say, I don't know, but I know what you're claiming is either fallacious or hasn't been proven. Like, and there's beauty in that in itself, I think. And
the one, I don't want to say slippery slope, but one of many slippery slopes, if you will, is that when you are set on, just continuing to falsify all the things that clearly aren't true, is that you get to a point where you're like, oh my God, I think I found it. And then you can get stuck there, and then you can like get entrenched in that thing. And it's like, you have to, this is where the identity piece really comes in. And it's really important that we be careful not to fully self-identify with anything. Yep.
I mean, I agree to a point, other than like we talked about last night. Like, I do think there's things, I'm going to be dogmatic about certain things. I'm going to be dogmatic that murder is wrong. I just am. You know what I mean? But I mean, people could take you to task on that. Well, how do you know? How do you know? That's, again, I'll be dogmatic on that. And most people are.
And I said that in an absolute way.
I know what you meant. I know what you meant. I do. I'm just trying to be pedantic here. But there are certain things, and then other things that I used to probably be like, no, it's got to be this. I'm like, I don't know. I have a feeling it's this, but I'm not 100% sure. What's your, what do you think? And then you have conversations with people, and it's okay that you're not going to agree on everything. Like, there's some things that you'll disagree on that might actually cause a rift, and that's okay too. Yeah. It is okay. You're not going to be best friends with everybody. Mm-hmm. For some people, it's just a chemical thing. You don't, whatever you want to call it, chemistry, it's not there. But other things, there are certain worldviews where there's such a clash. You're not going to be friends. But that's not with everybody. And so be willing to meet people kind of where they are and just have conversations. And if you see that when you start trying to pry a little bit that they haven't even ever thought about this stuff, you don't have to push them on the fallacies and all that. They're not there. And that's okay, because there's stuff I'm not there. I mean, I know that with us, like I look back at 10 years ago and now where I am now, and I go, why did I think that 10? And I'm going to do that in 10 years probably now and go, man, what an idiot I was. And that's okay. That's the journey, and that's growth and learning wisdom and discernment and all that stuff.
I think that's a really cool thing. It shows that you are willing to have your, I won't say your whole paradigm flipped upside down, but really willing to continue to question and refine what you think at this moment and continue on.
I think there's beauty in that. Like, again, I know I bring up Scripture a lot, and I'm not pushing that on people. I'm saying from my own standpoint, like that was Acts 17, the Bereans, right? They were called the noblest of all because they didn't just believe what they were being told. They said, we're going to go to the Scriptures and see if what you're telling us is true. And they said, and they were applauded for that. And you could take that principle and apply it to all this other stuff. Like, don't just take my word and your word and somebody's word. To the best of your ability, try to go ascertain if this is true, or if not that, at least is it false? Or is what you're saying not supported? You know what I mean? Like, we should all, I think, do that.
Yeah.
So
I think it's resting comfortably in the not knowing, like we said. And then to bring back Walter Russell, I mentioned the other part of his quote last night as we close out here. I'd love to get your thoughts on this. He says that, again, if you're trying to figure out truth by looking in the world of transient effects, you're not going to be able to figure it out. And the only thing that you can really know is God. And that's where I've kind of taken empiricism, rationalism. So empiricism, I would consider that knowing of the body because it relies on senses. Rationalism, knowing of the mind. And again, there's a lot of crossover between the two, and you can falsify things that are clearly not true, right? But then there's like a third level, and this is my belief, ironically, but there's a third level, I would say, and that's mysticism. And that's the knowing of the spirit, the knowing of the soul, if you will. And that's what, Christians and what you would even say is the revelation of like God revealing to you directly. And that can only be cultivated by an inner relationship with God. Right. And again, that's my belief. Can I prove that? No, I absolutely cannot prove that. But I think there are several of us, irrespective of what our spiritual beliefs or religion is, that have that, like, that have had that experience of just this inner, I hate to call it knowing, but that's the only word that I can think to describe it, this inner knowing. And I think that is a connection point between us and God. And that's where I said last night, I don't call it intuition, because for me, intuition implies that it's just me.
Right.
I think it's something deeper than that. And that's why I call it mysticism. It's a cultivated relationship with me and my creator up there in here that I have.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And that's the third level of knowing.
I agree. And a Christian would call it the inner testimony of the Holy Spirit. Same thing. I am a firm believer that, like, I cannot actually know absolute truth by just looking at the world around me. Like, can I go out and look at a sunset or a mountain or a flower and just know by looking, without anything else in my mind, that God created that, or that I should praise God for that? No, I don't know that. I know it because God tells me that. Like the psalmist tells me that. You know what I mean? Like, this
you also feel it though.
You do,
know what I mean?
You do. But there's also people that I see say other things about those things that aren't even close to what I say about them. So then you're like, okay, where did they get their premises from?
Right.
And again, you're still stuck in this belief realm. You can't escape it, because I can just say this is my belief, and they would say the same thing. Well, I just believe it. That's okay.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, cool. I mean, really, like, I'm not gonna. This whole idea that you have to burn people at the stake because they don't believe what you believe is insane to me. And that's why I hate. And this would be a topic for a whole nother day. The whole like theonomy side of Christianity that wants to like dominate the world through the government and politics, because it's insane, and that's nowhere found in the Bible. First of all, people
when you say Jesus was an anarcho-capitalist,
well, yeah, I mean, people try to extrapolate the nation of Israel, which was, if you believe the Bible, for a very specific purpose, but God never prescribed, hey, all you guys go out and start forming these theocracies without me telling you what to do, and then go dominate your fellow man.
Right.
You cannot find that.
Yeah.
But yet you see so many Christians who are, and not just Christians, but people in general who love the state. But for Christians to do it hurts my soul. It really does.
Yeah.
And that's a topic for another day. But they're not getting those premises properly. They're they're getting there fallaciously, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I don't know how I got on that tangent, but I just want to throw that in there because it irks me to no end to see people wanting to dominate the world with laws and regulations because somebody doesn't believe what they believe. I mean, it's one thing to have to punish murder in whatever way. I mean, we can talk all day about ways that, you could do that in an anarcho-capitalist society,
right?
Honestly, because I think at some point you do have to deal with crime in some way. But just because you have to do that doesn't mean it has to be the way the state does it. Same with the prison system. It's insane.
Yeah. Especially because it's absent of forgiveness and absent of helping to bring people into a better way of being and acting. It actually creates, in many cases, them to be worse once they're let back into society.
Yeah, exactly. You throw them in a cage into these horrible conditions.
Right.
Why should this, again, totally different topic, but it's the state that somehow, it's like the crime wasn't against the state. No. The crime was against another human. They should really be the ones determining some of this stuff, or you know what I mean? Anyway,
or have a say in it.
Have a say in it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, again, biblically, somebody murders somebody, another family member could come in and kill that person,
right,
unless they got to a city of refuge first. That makes more sense than what we have now.
100%.
So anyway, just different wormhole there, but it's applicable.
But at the least, what we can rest on after this whole conversation, because again, someone could slip into nihilism, is that you have to have. You don't have to. It would benefit you to have a foundational belief that you truly feel inside that is pulling you in the direction to continue on. And I know for me, it's my relationship with God, and it's also knowing that this journey of continually peeling back the layers of what is not true, I have found refuge in that. I've made that wow, this is exciting, trying to figure out how this realm works. And it's not even in a way of oh, what are they hiding from us? Right. It's dang, I really just want to know how this world works. This is really cool. How powerful am I actually? How powerful are we when we all come together in community of people who are on the same path and of the same mindset, trying to figure out how all this works? What can we create together? Right. Wow, this is really cool.
And you could take that to different categories, right? Whether it's figuring things out with technology or figuring things out regarding the government. There's all these areas. And that's what I think, especially we who are voluntarists, anarcho-capitalists, because we understand that it's the ideas that are going to change people, that are going to change the world. Yeah. And it's not force, it's not doing all these other things. It's how you think about life and how you think about things. And if you, and again, you're back to kind of the consensus thing, because you're if you get enough people on board,
your mind is the same.
We're thinking about it, because you can't avoid that, but it is what it is. Right. There seems to be power in numbers. That doesn't mean that the majority rules necessarily, but you can still use that to your advantage. You know what I mean? But even if it's just you believing it, the problem is if you're fighting against everybody else, you're always going to be a prisoner. And so again, we're back in the weeds with how do you avoid consensus reality? How do you avoid subjectivity? All those things, but it doesn't matter. I still think in the end, changing ideas, starting with your neighbors and your friends and just talking these things through, get them to think harder about some of this stuff. I had that discussion in med school with a guy in the gym. He was talking about politics. And all I asked him was would it be okay for me to come to your house with a gun and demand money from you so that I could go do something for you that I thought was for your good? And he'd be like, no. I'm so why is it okay that the government does it? And why do you think it's okay that you can vote for other people to do that? And he didn't have anything to say about it.
No.
But it's that simple. And if you can get people on that level to boil things down to their simplest level of whether it's a moral issue like that, or if it's a scientific issue over here, that's what I feel like I focus on the most.
Right.
You and I both, I feel like, is because, and that's where you do come across as a little pedantic, but you want to be precise because it's about thinking properly. And a lot of people, once they do boil it down, because I was a statist.
Yeah.
Until, we talked about last night.
I went to West Point.
Yeah.
I was in the Army.
Yeah. And then something happened that I already knew, and I just saw it presented in a way, and it was a Ron Paul moment or something where he was talking about the immorality of war and being a Christian, and you can't, all these, and I was like, and I saw that collateral murder video, and it ripped my heart out. Mm-hmm. And it just changed me immediately. And I dove into Murray Rothbard and everything else on you know what I mean? Not saying he's right on everything either. I'm just saying it changed my way of thinking, and it came down to the simplest things, because these things are usually simple, and morality is pretty cut and dry, honestly. Most people at least would say so.
Yeah. So
if you go the moral route, you can't lose when it comes to all these arguments against the government. I don't give a crap about all their pragmatic, well, what about this? What about the roads? It's that's not an argument. It's not okay. You can't advocate violence just because you need better roads.
Right.
So sorry, tangent, but
no, it's a really important point.
It's important to think about your own presuppositions, examine why you have them, and do they lead to contradictions from your own worldview, from your base foundation of a moral compass, especially. Do the things you believe violate that? If they do, you need to re-examine what you believe.
Right.
Yep.
Right. And I think to wrap this up, it's that also coupled with, do they end up leading you or others who are claiming to represent your worldview violently enforcing it upon other people?
Yep. Yeah.
And that's where we...
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Topic for another day, but yeah.
We'll have to have you on for part 2 just to discuss that, man.
Awesome.
Yeah, this was so fun, dude.
Awesome, man.
Thank you so much for joining me.
Enjoy.